The fork in my hand didn't tremble. Not anymore. 23 people sat around my father's Christmas table, relatives, business partners, neighbors, invited to witness the annual ritual of my humiliation. The chandelier cast warm light on crystal glasses and cold smiles. My sister, Lila, golden child of the family, had just finished describing her new corner office. Her husband was already recording on his phone, ready to capture whatever cruelty came next. "Useless," my father said, pointing his steak knife at me. 40 years old and still useless. My mother's stepmother, technically though she'd made sure I never forgot the difference, laughed like he'd told the funniest joke. "Your sister makes $50,000 a month as CEO. Maybe you should take notes, learn something for once." The table erupted. Cousins snickered. My uncle shook his head in mock sympathy. Lila wouldn't meet my eyes, but her husband's camera stayed fixed on my face, waiting for tears. I set down my fork, adjusted my napkin, let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. $50,000 a month, I repeated softly. "That's impressive, Lila. Truly." My father beamed, thrilled. His favorite daughter was finally being acknowledged. "So starting January 1st, I continued, my voice flat and cold. "Her salary drops to $20,000, or she can resign. Her choice." The laughter died like someone had cut its throat. What happened next, the secrets I uncovered, the betrayal that nearly destroyed me, and the revenge that would take 3 decades to complete, changed everything. Stay with me until the end. I promise you the people who tried to break me never saw what was coming. And neither will you. My name is Grace Miller. I'm 40 years old, and according to Forbes magazine, I'm worth $86 million. I built a company that has helped over 15,000 women restart their lives after the world told them they were finished. But on this particular Christmas Eve, sitting at my father's mahogany dining table, I was still the family disappointment, the invisible daughter, the cautionary tale, the punchline to jokes I'd been hearing for 3 decades. The dining room looked exactly as it had every Christmas for as long as I could remember. White candles flickered in silver holders. The chandelier cast prismatic light across crystal glasses filled with wine I wasn't offered. Poinsettias lined the windowsills in perfect arrangement, my stepmother's annual declaration that this was a home of taste and refinement. 23 guests filled the seats around the extended table, aunts and uncles, cousins with their growing children, business associates. My father liked to impress neighbors who had witnessed my humiliation so many times it had become tradition. I sat at the far end as always, the seat nearest the kitchen, furthest from the head of the table where my father presided like a king surveying his domain. My stepmother, Patricia, sat at his right hand, her silver hair perfectly styled, her smile perfectly calibrated to convey warmth, while her eyes remained calculating and cold. And beside her, in the place of honor, sat my younger sister Lila, though she wasn't really my sister at all, a fact I had only recently confirmed after decades of suspicion. The first hour passed in familiar patterns. My father made pronouncements about the economy, about politics, about the declining state of everything except his own judgment. Patricia complimented the guests on their appearances while subtly cataloging their failures since last Christmas. Lila's husband, Derek, refilled wine glasses with the practiced ease of a man who understood his only value in this family was his willingness to perform whatever service was required. I ate my dinner in small bites, speaking only when directly addressed, which was rarely. A cousin asked me how work was going, and before I could answer, my father interrupted with a dismissive wave. "Grace is still doing her little computer thing," he said. "Helping old women write resumes or something. Very noble, I'm sure." The table chuckled appreciatively. I felt 23 pairs of eyes flick toward me, measuring my reaction, waiting for the flinch that would confirm I knew my place. I gave them nothing. My face remained pleasant and neutral, the mask I had perfected through decades of practice. But behind that mask I was paying attention. I noticed Derek shift his phone slightly, angling it toward me from where it rested against his water glass. I noticed Lila glance at the screen and suppress a smile. They were recording. They were actually recording this dinner planning to capture whatever fresh humiliation awaited me and share it with their followers like a holiday special. My family had always treated me with contempt, But this was something new. This was turning my pain into content. This was monetizing my degradation for likes and comments from strangers who would laugh at the pathetic older sister, while Lila basked in their sympathy and admiration. I said nothing. I simply filed this information away with all the others, another piece of evidence in a case I had been building for longer than they could possibly imagine. Patricia tapped her knife against her glass, drawing the room's attention. Her face glowed with the particular satisfaction she always wore when preparing to deliver news that would make her daughter shine brighter by making me look dimmer. "I have a wonderful announcement," she said. "As many of you know, Lila has been working so hard at her company, and I'm thrilled to share that she's just been promoted to CEO. She's now earning $50,000 per month." The reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Applause broke out around the table. My aunt reached across to squeeze Lila's hand. My father beamed with undisguised pride, his chest swelling, as though Lila's success were his own achievement, which in his mind it certainly was. $50,000 a month, my uncle whistled. "That's incredible, Lila. You should be so proud." "We are proud," my father said firmly. "This is what happens when you raise a daughter with proper values, with ambition, with the right priorities." He didn't look at me as he said this. He didn't need to. Everyone at the table understood who was being contrasted with Lila's shining example. Patricia turned toward me, then her smile sharpening. "Grace, dear, perhaps you could learn something from your sister. She's younger than you by over a decade, and look what she's accomplished. Maybe you could ask her for career advice." The laughter that followed was louder this time, meaner. Derek's phone captured it, all my family's cruel amusement. Lila's modest shrug that somehow conveyed agreement with every word, my own silent presence at the end of the table, like a ghost who hadn't realized she was already dead. And something in me shifted, not broke. I had been broken before many times, and I knew what that felt like. This was different. This was a lock finally turning after years of searching for the right key. This was the moment I had been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting. I set down my fork. I placed my napkin beside my plate with deliberate care, and I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress, as every head in the room turned toward me. $50,000 per month, I said, and my voice was calm, almost conversational. "That's quite impressive, Lila. You must be very proud." Lila's smile flickered with uncertainty. This wasn't how our script usually went. I was supposed to absorb the insult, perhaps mumble something self-deprecating, certainly not command the attention of the entire room. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "I do have one question, though." I picked up my wine glass and took a slow sip, aware that every eye remained fixed on me. "Did the board inform you of the changes to your compensation package, the ones that take effect in January?" Confusion rippled across Lila's face. "What changes? What are you talking about? Starting next month?" I said, setting down the glass with a soft click. "Your salary drops to $20,000. Unless you'd prefer to resign, of course. That's entirely your choice." The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Patricia's face went pale. My father half rose from his chair, his mouth working soundlessly. Around the table, guests exchanged bewildered glances, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. And Lila Golden, perfect, always favored. Lila stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "That's not possible," she whispered. "You can't—" "Outside," I said quietly. "Now, we need to talk about who really owns that company." The cold December air hit my face as I stepped onto my father's back porch, Lila following behind me with unsteady steps. But before I tell you what happened in that conversation, before I reveal the secrets that would unravel everything my family had built on lies, I need you to understand something. I need you to understand the girl I used to be, the child who learned to become invisible because visibility only brought pain. My earliest memory of understanding my place in this family came when I was 5 years old. It was Christmas morning, and Lila, barely 3 at the time, sat surrounded by a mountain of wrapped presents while I watched from the corner of the living room with my small pile of 3 gifts. I remember counting them not out of greed, but out of confusion. I had been good all year. I had cleaned my room without being asked. I had earned gold stars at school. Yet Lila, who threw tantrums daily and broke toys within hours of receiving them, had presents stacked so high she couldn't see over them. When I asked my father why Lila had more presents, he didn't even look at me. He was too busy helping her tear open another box, his face glowing with joy I had never seen directed at me. It was Patricia who answered her voice, carrying that particular sweetness that always preceded cruelty. Lila is younger, Grace. She needs more encouragement. You're old enough to understand that some children require more attention than others. I was 5. I understood nothing except that my heart felt like someone had stepped on it. That pattern repeated every year, every birthday, every school event, every ordinary Tuesday. Lila received praise for breathing. I received criticism for excellence. When I brought home report cards covered in A grades, my father would glance at them briefly and ask why I hadn't joined more extracurricular activities like Lila. When Lila brought home C grades, he would praise her effort and take her out for ice cream as a reward for trying so hard. The message was clear and consistent. Nothing I did would ever be enough, and everything Lila did would always be celebrated. My father attended every single one of Lila's events, every dance recital where she stumbled through the choreography, every soccer game where she spent more time picking flowers on the sideline than playing, every school concert where she sang off-key with confident enthusiasm. He sat in the front row with his camera capturing every moment, his applause always the loudest in the auditorium. He never came to mine, not once. I won the state spelling bee in 4th grade and took a taxi home because no one remembered to pick me up. I performed the lead role in my middle school's production of The Diary of Anne Frank and delivered my monologue to an audience that included every parent except my own. I graduated high school as valedictorian and gave my speech to a sea of proud families, while the 2 seats reserved for my father and Patricia remained empty. They had taken Lila to a volleyball tournament that weekend, a tournament I later learned that she didn't even play in because she had twisted her ankle in practice. But the moment that truly taught me about my family's capacity for cruelty came when I was 12 years old. Her name was Mrs. Henderson, and she was my 7th grade English teacher. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of staying after class to talk with students who seemed troubled. She noticed me in a way no adult ever had, not with pity, but with recognition. She saw something in my writing and my test scores and the way I devoured books like a starving person finally offered food. One afternoon, she asked me to stay after class. She told me about a program for gifted students at a prestigious academy 2 towns over. Full scholarship, incredible opportunities, a chance to be surrounded by peers who would challenge and inspire me. She had already contacted them about my application. She believed in me, she said. She thought I had extraordinary potential. For one brief, shining week, I allowed myself to hope. I imagined a different life, classrooms full of students who loved learning as much as I did, teachers who encouraged curiosity instead of crushing at a future that extended beyond the suffocating walls of my father's house. I imagined becoming someone. Then Mrs. Henderson requested a meeting with my father to discuss the opportunity. I don't know what happened in that meeting. I wasn't allowed to attend, but I remember watching through the window as my father's car pulled into the school parking lot. I remember the 45 minutes that passed while they talked behind closed doors. I remember the way Mrs. Henderson's face looked when she emerged pale, shaken, unable to meet my eyes. The next week, she announced she was transferring to a school in another district. Family reasons, she told the class, a necessary change. But when she hugged me goodbye, her voice broke as she whispered in my ear, "I'm sorry, Grace. I'm so sorry. Please don't give up." I never found out exactly what my father said to her. I never found out what threats he made or what leverage he used. But I understood the lesson perfectly. Anyone who tried to help me would be punished. Anyone who saw my potential would be removed. My father would not allow witnesses to his treatment of me, and he would not allow anyone to offer me a way out. After that, I stopped hoping for allies. I stopped reaching out to teachers or counselors or anyone who might notice my pain. I learned to make myself small and quiet and unremarkable. I learned that survival meant invisibility, and invisibility meant protection. The girl who had once dreamed of gifted programs and prestigious academies disappeared, replaced by a ghost who moved through the world without leaving marks. But ghosts are good at noticing things that others miss. I was 16 when I found the photograph. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and Patricia had ordered me to clean out the attic as punishment for some imagined offense. I spent hours sorting through boxes of old clothes and broken furniture dust, coating my skin, and cobwebs catching in my hair. Most of what I found was worthless, discarded appliances, outdated decorations, tax documents from decades past. Then I opened a box labeled storage in my father's handwriting, and my world shifted on its axis. The photograph was buried beneath old bills and expired insurance papers. It showed two young women standing arm in arm in front of a flowering tree, their smiles bright with the particular joy of deep friendship. One of them I recognized instantly. Despite the passage of years, my mother, young and vibrant, her eyes holding a warmth I remembered from my earliest childhood before she allegedly abandoned us. The other woman I had never seen before. But on the back of the photograph, in my mother's familiar handwriting, were words that would haunt me for years. Eleanor and me, 1985, best friends forever. Eleanor. I had never heard this name. In all the years since my mother's departure, no one had ever mentioned that she had a best friend. No one had ever mentioned that there might be another person in the world who knew her, who loved her, who might know the truth about why she left. I hid the photograph in my sock drawer beneath winter clothes I rarely wore. I said nothing to my father or Patricia, but late at night when the house was silent and dark, I would take out that photo and study my mother's face, searching for answers in her frozen smile. Where was Eleanor now? Why had no one ever mentioned her? And if my mother had a best friend who clearly loved her, why would she have abandoned her own daughter without a word? The questions burned in my mind like embers that refused to die. And somewhere deep in my chest, a small flame of doubt began to grow. Doubt about everything I had been told, everything I had been forced to believe. The photograph of my mother and Eleanor stayed hidden in my drawer for 2 years, a secret I carried like a stone in my pocket. But the questions it raised only grew heavier with time pressing against my chest whenever I looked at my father's face and wondered what else he had lied about. To understand why that photograph mattered so much, I need to take you back further to the day that divided my life into before and after the day I lost my mother and gained a wound that would never fully heal. I was 14 years old, and it was a Thursday in October. I remember this because Thursdays were the days my mother and I had our special tradition. She would pick me up from school, and we would stop at a little bakery on Maple Street for hot chocolate and almond croissants. We would sit in the corner booth by the window and talk about everything: my classes, my dreams, the books I was reading, the future she insisted would be bright, despite the shadows that had begun to creep into our home. Those Thursday afternoons were the only times I felt truly seen, truly loved, truly safe. But that particular Thursday, my mother's car wasn't waiting in the pickup line. I stood on the sidewalk for 30 minutes, watching other parents collect their children, telling myself she must be running late. Eventually, I walked home alone, a journey of 2 miles that felt like 20. With every step, a cold dread grew in my stomach, a premonition I couldn't name but couldn't shake. The house was quiet when I arrived, too quiet. I called out for my mother and received no answer. I climbed the stairs to my parents' bedroom, and that's when I saw it. Her closet doors standing open, the hangers empty, the shelves bare. Her perfume bottles were gone from the dresser. Her jewelry box had vanished. The framed photograph of her and me at the beach, the one she kept on her nightstand, had disappeared as if it had never existed. Her scent still lingered in the air, a ghost of vanilla and jasmine that made my throat close with sudden, overwhelming grief. I stood in that doorway for what felt like hours, my backpack still on my shoulders, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. When I finally went downstairs, my father was sitting in his leather armchair in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He wasn't crying. He wasn't upset. His face held the same cold composure I had seen when he fired employees or ended business relationships that no longer served him. He looked at me with something that might have been satisfaction, though at the time I was too shocked to recognize it. "Your mother left," he said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. "She doesn't want to be part of this family anymore. She doesn't want you." Those last 3 words hit me like a physical blow. She doesn't want you. I felt my knees buckle, felt myself grab the doorframe for support, felt the first tears spill down my cheeks before I could stop them. That's not true, I whispered. She wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. She wouldn't leave me. My father took a slow sip of his whiskey. She did exactly that. Some women aren't meant to be mothers, Grace. Your mother was one of them. The sooner you accept that, the better. I refused to accept it. In the weeks that followed, I wrote letters, desperate pleading letters to every address I could think of. I wrote to my grandmother's house begging for information about where my mother might have gone. I wrote to my mother's college roommate whose address I found in an old Christmas card. I wrote to General Delivery at 3 different post offices, hoping against hope that somehow my words would find her. Every letter went unanswered. What I didn't know then was that my father had intercepted them all. He monitored the mailbox like a prison guard collecting my outgoing letters before they could be sent, confiscating any replies that might have come. He controlled the telephone, the family computer, every possible avenue of communication. He built a wall around me so complete that I couldn't see it, let alone climb over it. And while he isolated me, he rewrote history. At family gatherings, he told relatives that my mother had always been unstable, prone to erratic behavior and emotional outbursts. He suggested she had mental health issues she had hidden during their marriage. He painted a portrait of a woman who was selfish at her core, incapable of putting anyone's needs above her own desires. Patricia, who appeared in our lives with suspicious speed just 6 months after my mother's departure, reinforced these narratives with sad sighs and knowing looks. "Your poor father," she would say. "He tried so hard to make it work. Some people just can't be helped." I was 14, grieving and completely alone. I had no allies, no advocates, no one to tell me that the story I was being fed might not be the truth. Gradually, inevitably, I began to believe it. I began to believe that my mother had looked at me and found me wanting. I began to believe that I was fundamentally unlovable, that something in me had driven her away, that if I had been better, smarter, prettier, easier, she might have stayed. That belief poisoned everything. It poisoned my relationships, my self-worth, my capacity to trust. It became the lens through which I viewed every interaction, always waiting for the moment when people would see my inadequacy and leave. But here is what I didn't know then, what I wouldn't discover until decades later. When the truth finally clawed its way into the light, my mother didn't leave because she didn't want me. She left because she loved me too much to stay. My father had discovered something I still don't fully understand even now, and he used it as a weapon. He told my mother that if she ever contacted me, if she ever tried to see me or speak to me or send so much as a birthday card, he would destroy my future completely. He had connections, he told her. He had resources. He would make sure I never got into college, never got a decent job, never had a chance at a normal life. The only way to protect me was to disappear entirely. My mother, faced with an impossible choice, chose my future over her own heart. She walked away with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burden of grief I cannot imagine. She spent years believing that her absence was her final gift to me, that her silence was a form of love. Only one person knew the truth. Only one person stayed connected to my mother through all those years of exile, passing along scraps of information, confirming that her daughter was still alive, even if she couldn't reach her. Eleanor, the woman in the photograph. My mother's best friend, sworn to secrecy, keeping a promise that must have felt like carrying broken glass in her bare hands. But I knew none of this at 14. I knew only that my mother was gone, that my letters went unanswered, that my father's version of events seemed to be the only version that existed. I stopped writing after 3 months. I stopped hoping after 6. By the time a year had passed, I had buried my grief so deep that I almost convinced myself it wasn't there anymore. Almost. And then one night, when I was 15, I heard something that cracked the foundation of everything I had been forced to believe. I was supposed to be asleep. It was past midnight, and I had crept downstairs to get a glass of water. As I passed my father's study, I heard his voice, low, tense, speaking into the telephone with an urgency I had never heard before. "She can never find out what really happened," he said. If she does, everything falls apart. Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, it all comes down. I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding so loud I was certain he would hear it. Just make sure the documents stay buried, he continued, and make sure that woman keeps her mouth shut. I don't care what it costs. He hung up the phone. I fled back upstairs on silent feet, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What really happened? What documents? What woman? And what was my father so desperate to hide? The phone conversation I overheard that night haunted me for months, replaying in my mind during sleepless hours when the house was dark and quiet. But I was 15, powerless and terrified of what my father might do if he discovered I had been listening. So I buried that memory alongside all the others, adding it to the growing collection of secrets and suspicions I carried like stones in my pockets. Life continued in its painful patterns, and exactly 1 year after my mother vanished, my father introduced a new element into our household that would reshape everything I thought I understood about my place in this family. Her name was Lila, and she was barely 4 years old when she arrived. I remember the day with strange clarity. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, almost exactly 12 months since I'd come home to find my mother's closet empty. My father called me into the living room with unusual formality, and when I entered, I found him standing beside a small girl with dark curls and enormous brown eyes. She clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest and looked around our house with the wary expression of an animal unsure whether it had found shelter or a trap. "This is Lila," my father announced. "She's a relative's child who needs a home. She'll be living with us from now on. I expect you to treat her like a sister." That was the entire explanation. No details about which relative, no context about why this child had suddenly appeared, no discussion about how our household would change to accommodate her. Just a decree delivered in my father's typical manner, absolute, unquestionable final. I was 15 and desperately lonely. My mother was gone. Mrs. Henderson had been driven away. I had learned to make myself invisible to survive, but invisibility is its own kind of prison. When I looked at this frightened little girl standing in our living room, I didn't see a threat or an imposition. I saw possibility. I saw someone who might need me, someone I could love and protect, someone who might love me back in a house where love had become as scarce as water in a desert. I knelt down to Lila's level and smiled at her with genuine warmth. "Hi, Lila, I'm Grace. I'm going to be your big sister. Would you like to see your new room?" She nodded slowly, still clutching her rabbit, and when I extended my hand, she took it. Her small fingers wrapped around mine with a trust that made my heart ache. In that moment, I made a silent promise to myself I would be the family this child deserved. I would give her the love and attention I had been denied. I would make sure she never felt as alone as I did. I kept that promise for years, even as it became increasingly clear that my devotion would never be reciprocated by the adults in our household. The favoritism began almost immediately and escalated with each passing year until it became grotesque in its obviousness. Lila received new clothes for every season, designer labels, perfectly fitted, always in the latest styles. I wore hand-me-downs from cousins' items that were often stained or torn, always at least 2 years out of fashion. When I outgrew my shoes, I was told to make do until the budget allowed for replacements. When Lila mentioned that her sneakers felt tight, my father took her shopping that same afternoon and returned with 4 new pairs. Lila's bedroom was redecorated 3 times before she turned 10, each iteration more elaborate than the last custom furniture-themed wallpaper, a canopy bed that looked like it belonged in a magazine. My room remained exactly as it had been since childhood, with the same faded curtains and scratched dresser, the same twin bed with its sagging mattress that hurt my back every night. When Lila turned 16, my father presented her with a brand new car, a gleaming red convertible with a bow on the hood, purchased the same week she received her driver's license. I was 17 at the time and had been begging for driving lessons for 2 years. Every time I asked, my father found an excuse. We couldn't afford the insurance, the timing wasn't right. I needed to focus on my studies. When I pointed out that Lila was receiving both a license and a car, while I couldn't even practice in an empty parking lot, my father's response became the refrain that would define my adolescence. "Lila needs more support," he said, not even looking up from his newspaper. "You're strong enough to manage on your own." Strong enough. As if my strength were a punishment rather than an achievement. As if my ability to survive without help meant I deserved to receive none. My father had transformed my resilience into justification for his neglect, and the twisted logic was so complete that I sometimes found myself believing it. Maybe I was too strong. Maybe needing nothing was the same as deserving nothing. The disparity extended beyond material goods, into the very fabric of how we were treated. When Lila struggled in school, tutors were hired immediately. When I struggled, I was told to try harder. When Lila broke curfew, my father laughed about her spirited nature. When I came home 10 minutes late from the library, I was grounded for a month. When Lila expressed interest in dance, she was enrolled in the most expensive studio in the city. When I expressed interest in anything at all, I was reminded that resources were limited and priorities had to be set. I spent years telling myself that Lila was younger, that she was adjusting to a new home, that she needed extra support because of whatever mysterious circumstances had brought her to us. I made excuses for my father's behavior because the alternative, accepting that he simply loved her more, was too painful to contemplate. I continued trying to be a good sister, helping Lila with homework, comforting her when she was sad, celebrating her achievements, even as my own went unnoticed. But now, standing at 40 years old, with the perspective of distance and the clarity of finally opening my eyes, I began to see patterns I had been too close to recognize before. Lila arrived exactly 1 year after my mother left, not approximately 1 year, not around that time. Exactly 12 months later, as if her appearance had been planned, scheduled, waiting for some arbitrary period of mourning to expire. My father's protectiveness of Lila went beyond normal parental concern into something almost obsessive. He monitored her friendships, controlled her schedule, became irrationally angry if anyone questioned her or criticized her in even the mildest terms. Patricia deferred to Lila in ways she never deferred to anyone, treating this child not as a stepdaughter, but almost as a superior. And my grandmother, my father's mother, who visited twice a year with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, would sometimes look at Lila with an expression I couldn't interpret. It wasn't love exactly, nor disapproval. It was something more complicated, something that looked almost like recognition. Once I caught my grandmother staring at Lila during Christmas dinner, with her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes clouded with what might have been guilt. The pieces of a puzzle I never knew existed were beginning to arrange themselves into a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to see. Lila's convenient timing, my father's irrational devotion, the complete absence of any information about which relative had supposedly given up this child. The way no one ever spoke about Lila's origins, as if the topic were surrounded by invisible electric fences. 3 months after that Christmas confrontation, when I finally had access to my father's private files, through means I'll explain later, I found the document that confirmed my suspicions. It was a birth certificate, Lila's birth certificate. The paper was slightly yellowed with age, the official seal still visible in the corner. Her name was printed clearly at the top along with her date of birth, a date that placed her conception during the final year of my parents' marriage. In the space for the father's name, there was my father's signature and information clear as day. In the space for the mother's name, there was nothing, just a blank line where someone's identity should have been. No name, no information, just empty space as if Lila had appeared from nowhere, claimed by my father alone. I stared at that blank space for a long time, understanding finally taking shape. Lila wasn't a relative's child who needed a home. Lila was my father's daughter, but she wasn't my mother's child. The discovery of Lila's birth certificate changed something fundamental in my understanding of my family. The blank space where a mother's name should have been told a story my father had worked hard to conceal, a story of betrayal that predated my mother's disappearance and might have caused it. But at 15, 16, 17, I had no power to act on this knowledge. I was still trapped in my father's house, still dependent on his resources, still hoping that somehow I might earn enough favor to escape through legitimate means. I clung to the belief that education would be my salvation, that if I worked hard enough and performed well enough, I would eventually find my way to freedom. I had no idea that my father had already ensured that path would be blocked. I graduated high school with honors ranking third in my class, despite receiving none of the support lavished on Lila. My teachers wrote glowing recommendation letters. My test scores placed me in the top percentile nationally. And in the spring of my senior year, I received news that felt like the first ray of sunlight. After years of darkness, I had been accepted to a respected university with a partial scholarship that would cover 60% of my tuition. 60% wasn't everything, but it was more than I had dared to hope for. The remaining costs were substantial but manageable if I had access to the savings account my parents had promised me since childhood. Every birthday, every Christmas, my father had mentioned this account in passing. "We're putting money aside for your education." He would say the words delivered with just enough sincerity to make me believe them. "When the time comes, it will be there." The time had come. I was 18 years old, standing in my father's study with my acceptance letter in hand, finally ready to claim the future I had worked so hard to earn. "I need to access my education savings," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the hope threatening to crack it. "The university needs confirmation of funding by next month." My father looked up from his desk with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been amusement. It might have been satisfaction. In retrospect, I think it was both. "What education savings?" he asked. "The account you've been contributing to since I was a child. You've mentioned it every year. You said it would be there when I needed it for college." My father leaned back in his chair and laughed. Not a chuckle or a surprised burst of humor, but a long, deliberate laugh that made my stomach drop. "That money went to Lila's private school years ago," he said. "If you wanted a full ride, you should have worked harder for a full scholarship. Plenty of students manage without family support. I'm sure you'll figure something out." I stood there in silence, processing the magnitude of what he had just told me. The savings that had been promised to me, that I had counted on, that had formed the foundation of every plan I had made for my future, gone. Spent on Lila's private education without my knowledge or consent. My father had watched me work toward this moment for years, knowing the entire time that he had already sabotaged it. "You could take out loans," Patricia added from the doorway where she had materialized to witness my humiliation. "Many young people do. It builds character." Character. As if I hadn't been building character my entire life, surviving in a household that treated me like an unwanted guest. I couldn't afford the university, not even with loans that would have buried me in debt for decades. The partial scholarship wasn't enough on its own, and my father's sabotage had left me with nothing. I watched my acceptance letter become meaningless, my dreams of escape dissolving like morning frost under a harsh sun. But I refused to give up entirely. If I couldn't attend my dream school, I would find another way. I enrolled in community college, determined to build a foundation I could transfer later. And to pay for even those modest costs, I entered a period of my life that I can only describe as survival mode. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously, stacking shifts like blocks in a wall that kept me standing through sheer, stubborn will. My alarm rang at 4 in the morning, giving me just enough time to shower and dress before my first shift at a diner on the edge of town. I waitressed from 5 a.m. until noon, serving coffee and eggs to truckers and early risers, my feet aching before the sun was fully up. After my diner shift, I went directly to an office building downtown, where I cleaned bathrooms and vacuumed carpets until 5 in the evening. Then I drove my dying car to a grocery store where I stocked shelves until midnight, hauling boxes and organizing inventory until my arms trembled and my vision blurred. I attended community college classes in the gaps between work, sitting in lecture halls, while fighting to keep my eyes open, taking notes with hands that shook from exhaustion. I studied on my breaks, eating whatever cheap food I could afford while memorizing formulas and historical dates. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. 4 hours on good nights, 2 on bad ones, sometimes none at all when deadlines collided. My body began to break down. I developed chronic exhaustion that turned simple tasks into monumental efforts. I caught every cold that circulated through the diner, my immune system too depleted to fight back. Missed meals became normal as I chose between food and textbooks, bus fare, and lunch. I lost 15 pounds. I couldn't afford to lose my clothes, hanging loose on a frame that was becoming gaunt. One morning during my diner shift, the world suddenly tilted sideways, and I found myself on the floor without any memory of falling. I had fainted behind the counter, collapsing onto the cold tile, while customers stared and coworkers shouted for help. The manager sent me home early that day, without pay, of course, and told me to get some rest. I went back to my tiny rented room and waited for my phone to ring. Surely someone from my family had heard what happened. Surely my father or Patricia or even Lila would call to check on me to ask if I was okay, to offer some small gesture of concern. No one called. Not that day, not the next, not ever. I doubt they even knew I had collapsed, and I'm certain they wouldn't have cared if they did. It was during this period, while organizing my financial aid paperwork with trembling hands and bleary eyes, that I discovered something that made my blood run cold. I was sorting through old documents I had requested from the financial aid office, trying to reconcile my records with the school's requirements. Among the papers was a form I didn't recognize, a loan application from a bank I had never heard of, dated when I was 14 years old. My signature was at the bottom of the page. Except it wasn't my signature. It was close. Someone had practiced my handwriting, copying the way I formed my letters, but I knew I had never signed this document. I had been 14. I couldn't have legally signed anything. I dug deeper, my exhaustion forgotten as adrenaline surged through my veins. I found more documents, credit applications, business filings, liability waivers, all bearing my forged signature, all dated during my early teenage years. Someone had used my identity, my social security number, my name to secure funds and establish accounts I knew nothing about. The implications were too enormous to fully process. My hands shook as I made copies of every document, hiding the originals in a locked box I kept under my bed. I didn't know what to do with this information, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would need proof someday. It took me weeks to trace the documents to their source, following a paper trail that led through shell companies and business registrations. And when I finally understood what I was looking at, the ground shifted beneath my feet once more. Every forged document was connected to a single business venture, a real estate development project that had collapsed spectacularly, leaving debts and lawsuits in its wake. The timing of the collapse matched the year my mother disappeared. The primary investor listed on the paperwork was my father. He had used my identity to shield himself from liability. He had made his 14-year-old daughter responsible for debts she knew nothing about. And whatever had happened with that failed business, whatever secrets those documents contained, I was beginning to suspect they were connected to the night my mother walked out the door and never came back. The forged documents haunted me for months, their implications growing more disturbing the longer I examined them. My father had used my identity to commit fraud, had implicated his teenage daughter in a business collapse that coincided with my mother's disappearance. The connections felt too significant to be coincidental, yet I had no way to investigate further while still trapped in the orbit of his control. I needed distance. I needed independence. I needed to survive long enough to find answers. But survival, I was about to learn, would demand sacrifices I never imagined I could endure. My situation deteriorated slowly at first, then all at once. The 3 jobs that had barely sustained me began to slip away one by one. The diner reduced my hours when business slowed. The office cleaning company lost its contract and laid off half its staff. The grocery store hired a manager who decided I looked too tired to be reliable and cut my shifts to almost nothing. Within 2 months, I went from barely surviving to drowning. I couldn't afford my rented room anymore. The landlord gave me 2 weeks to come up with the back rent I owed, and when I couldn't, he changed the locks while I was at class. I came home to find my belongings in garbage bags on the curb, my key no longer working, my last semblance of stability destroyed. Everything I owned fit into the trunk of my car, a rusted 1989 Honda Civic I had purchased for $800 from a man who warned me the transmission was temperamental. The passenger window didn't roll up completely, leaving a gap that let in cold air and rain. The heater worked only intermittently, coughing warm air for a few minutes before dying entirely. The seats were torn, the floor mats were missing, and the engine made sounds that suggested it was held together by hope and rust. That car became my home for the next 8 months. I learned to navigate a world that most people never see, a shadow existence that operates in parking lots and back alleys while respectable society sleeps. I discovered which lots had security guards who would chase me away and which ones turned a blind eye to a young woman sleeping in her car. I found the gym that charged only $10 a month for basic membership, and I showered there every morning before dawn, washing quickly in the cold spray while pretending I was just an early riser getting a workout before work. Food became a constant calculation. I ate whatever I could afford, which was almost nothing. The diner, where I still occasionally picked up shifts, let employees take home food that would otherwise be thrown away: stale bread, bruised fruit sandwiches that had sat too long under the heat lamps. I learned which grocery stores discarded expired items at which times, and I became adept at retrieving them before the garbage trucks arrived. Pride is a luxury that disappears quickly when your stomach has been empty for 3 days. Winter arrived with brutal indifference to my circumstances. November brought temperatures that dropped below freezing, and I learned what it meant to be truly cold, not the discomfort of forgetting a jacket, but the bone-deep ache that makes you wonder if you will survive until morning. I layered every piece of clothing I owned, wearing 3 shirts and 2 pairs of pants, and still shivering so violently that my teeth chattered for hours. I stuffed newspaper into the gap in my window and draped a blanket over myself like a cocoon, but nothing could fully block the cold that crept in through every crack and seam. On the worst nights, I would start the car and run the heater for 10 minutes, just enough to take the edge off before the engine's complaints forced me to turn it off. I rationed gas like a precious resource, calculating exactly how much I needed to drive to class and back, never allowing myself the luxury of warmth that might strand me without fuel. And yet somehow, through all of it, I never stopped attending my classes. I sat in lecture halls with hunger gnawing at my stomach and exhaustion pressing against my eyes, and I took notes with fingers that were sometimes too cold to grip the pen properly. I turned in assignments written on the back of discarded receipts when I couldn't afford paper. I studied in the library until closing time, not just because I was dedicated to learning, but because the library was warm and the chairs were soft, and for a few hours I could pretend I was a normal student with a normal life. I refused to give up. I refused to let my father's sabotage and my family's cruelty be the final chapter of my story. Something in me, stubbornness perhaps, or spite, or some flicker of hope I couldn't quite extinguish, kept me moving forward, even when forward felt impossible. It was on one of the coldest nights of that November, when the temperature had dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of my windshield, that everything changed. I was sitting in my usual parking lot behind a closed shopping center, too cold to sleep, too exhausted to do anything but stare at the frost patterns spreading across the glass. My body had stopped shivering, which I knew was a bad sign. The body shivers to generate heat, and when it stops, it means it's beginning to surrender. A knock on my window startled me so badly I nearly screamed. An elderly woman stood outside my car, her face weathered by years of hard living, her clothes worn but clean. She was homeless, I could tell from the way she carried herself from the shopping cart parked a few feet away that contained everything she owned. She gestured for me to roll down my window, and when I did, cracking it just enough to hear her, she didn't ask for money or food or anything at all. Instead, she held out half of a sandwich wrapped in a paper napkin. "You look like you need this more than I do," she said. Her voice was kind rough around the edges, but warm underneath. I tried to refuse. Even in my desperation, I couldn't take food from someone who had less than I did. But she insisted, pressing the sandwich through the gap in my window until I had no choice but to accept it. "My name's Maggie," she said. "Mind if I sit with you for a while? It's cold out here and I could use some company." She climbed into my passenger seat without waiting for an answer, bringing with her the smell of cold air and cheap soap and something that might have been lavender. We sat together in silence for a few minutes while I ate the sandwich turkey and cheese, slightly stale, but the most delicious thing I had tasted in weeks. Then Maggie began to talk. She told me her story in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has made peace with tragedy. She had been an accountant once successful and respected with a house in the suburbs and a retirement fund and all the trappings of middle-class American life. Then she discovered her husband had been cheating on her for 15 years. She filed for divorce, expecting fairness, and instead found herself destroyed by a legal system that favored his money and connections over her truth. She lost everything: her home, her savings, her career, her sense of self. "I spent years being angry," she said. "Then I spent years being sad. Now I'm just trying to survive, same as you." We talked until the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I told her things I had never told anyone about my mother's disappearance, my father's cruelty, the forged documents, the stolen savings. She listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, her eyes reflecting a deep understanding that came from shared suffering. As the sun crept above the horizon, Maggie prepared to leave. But before she went, she placed her hand over mine and spoke words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. "You're not broken, child," she said softly. "You're just being bent. Bent things can spring back. Broken things can't. You're still springing. I can see it in you." Then she pressed a crumpled piece of paper into my palm and climbed out of the car, gathering her shopping cart and shuffling toward whatever destination awaited her. I looked down at the paper. On it, written in careful handwriting, was a name and phone number: Eleanor Brooks. "Tell her Maggie sent you. She helps women like us." Eleanor Brooks, the name from the photograph. My mother's best friend. The woman in the picture smiling beside a mother I had been told abandoned me. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the paper. This couldn't be coincidence. This couldn't be chance. Of all the parking lots in all the cities in America, a homeless woman had knocked on my window and handed me the name of the one person who might know the truth about what happened to my mother. Eleanor Brooks might still be alive, and she might have answers to questions I had carried for almost a decade. I held on to that crumpled piece of paper for 3 days before I found the courage to use it. 3 days of sitting in my frozen car, staring at the name Eleanor Brooks, wondering if this was a path to answers or simply another door that would slam in my face. I had learned to expect disappointment. I had learned that hope was dangerous, that reaching out only invited rejection. But Maggie's words echoed in my mind: "You're still springing," and something in me refused to let fear make this decision. On the 4th day, I drove to the address listed beneath the phone number. The nonprofit occupied a modest storefront in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, wedged between a laundromat and a vacant lot. The sign above the door read, "Second Chances Workforce Development for Women," in letters that had once been bright blue but had faded to a tired gray. Through the window, I could see desks cluttered with papers, filing cabinets lining the walls, and a handful of women working at computers with expressions of determined concentration. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, rehearsing what I would say. I had no idea how to explain my situation without sounding desperate or deranged. "Hi, a homeless woman gave me your name. I think you knew my mother before she abandoned me. Can you tell me why my life fell apart?" The words sounded absurd even in my own head. Finally, I forced myself out of the car and through the front door. The woman who looked up from the reception desk was not what I expected. Eleanor Brooks was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant twist and reading glasses perched on her nose. Her clothes were modest, a simple blouse, practical slacks, but she wore them with a grace that suggested she had once inhabited finer things. What struck me most were her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and filled with a warmth that seemed to see past surfaces into something deeper. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had received an excellent education. "I'm looking for Eleanor Brooks," I managed. "Maggie sent me. She said you help women like us." The change in Eleanor's expression was subtle, but unmistakable. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, her composure cracked. Something flickered across her face that looked like recognition, like shock, like the sudden surfacing of a memory long submerged. Then it was gone, replaced by a careful neutrality that told me she was working hard to control her reaction. "Maggie," she repeated softly. "I haven't heard that name in a while. Please sit down. I'll make us some tea." She led me to a small office at the back of the building, closing the door behind us with a gentle click. The room was cluttered but organized with bookshelves overflowing and motivational posters covering the walls. She prepared tea with movements that were precise and unhurried, as if this small ritual of hospitality was sacred to her. When she handed me the cup and sat down across from me, she simply said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about my childhood, about Lila's arrival, and the favoritism that followed. I told her about my mother's disappearance and the story I had been fed about abandonment. I told her about the stolen savings, the forged documents, the business venture that collapsed the same year my mother left. I told her about the jobs I had lost, and the car I was living in, and the cold that had seeped so deep into my bones I wasn't sure it would ever leave. Eleanor listened without interrupting once. Her face remained composed, but her eyes grew increasingly bright, and twice I saw her blink rapidly as if fighting back tears. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her tea growing cold in her hands. "You've survived things that would have destroyed most people," she finally said. "The fact that you're still here, still fighting, tells me everything I need to know about who you are." She offered me a job that same afternoon. Nothing glamorous, she warned: administrative work, filing, answering phones, helping clients with paperwork. The hours were stable, and the pay was modest but livable. More importantly, she told me I would have access to the resources of the nonprofit shower facilities, a break room with food connections to housing assistance programs that could help me find a real place to live. I accepted before she finished the sentence. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor became something I had never had before: a mentor who believed in me unconditionally. She noticed everything: the way I flinched when someone moved too quickly in my peripheral vision, how I ate my lunch in rapid bites, as if afraid the food might be taken away, my difficulty accepting compliments or kindness of any kind. She never commented on these behaviors directly, but she adapted to them, moving slowly when she approached my desk, making sure food was always available in the break room, offering praise in gentle doses that I could absorb without panicking. Slowly, carefully, she began to teach me. She gave me books about business and finance, dog-eared volumes with notes in the margins that showed they had been read many times. She explained concepts like compound interest and market positioning and the importance of building multiple income streams. She introduced me to women who had rebuilt their lives after devastating losses. Successful entrepreneurs, executives, artists, all of whom had once been clients of Second Chances and were now thriving beyond anything they had imagined possible. "You have a mind for strategy," Eleanor told me one afternoon after I had reorganized the filing system in a way that cut our processing time in half. "You see patterns other people miss. That's a rare gift, Grace. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Under her guidance, my shattered confidence began slowly to rebuild. I started speaking up in meetings, offering suggestions that were actually implemented. I began to believe tentatively that I might have value beyond my capacity for suffering. Eleanor treated me not as a charity case, but as a colleague, as someone with potential that simply hadn't been allowed to flourish. But for all her openness about business and strategy and life philosophy, there was one topic Eleanor refused to discuss. I showed her the photograph one evening after most of the staff had gone home, the picture of my mother and Eleanor, young and smiling best friends, forever written on the back in my mother's handwriting. Eleanor looked at it for a long moment, her face unreadable, then handed it back without meeting my eyes. "Some stories take time to tell," she said quietly. "Trust is earned through patience. When the time is right, I'll explain everything. But not yet. Please, not yet." I wanted to push. I wanted to demand answers to questions that had haunted me for years. But something in Eleanor's voice, a tremor of pain beneath the careful composure, stopped me. She was carrying something heavy, something connected to my mother, something she wasn't ready to share. I decided to give her the time she asked for. Patience. Trust. I could try. 3 months after I started working at Second Chances, something happened that changed my understanding of everything. It was late past 9 o'clock and I had stayed behind to finish a grant application with a looming deadline. Eleanor was in her office door, slightly ajar, and I needed her signature on the final page. I approached quietly, not wanting to startle her, and that's when I saw her phone screen light up on her desk. She was typing a text message, her back partially turned to the door, unaware that I could see the screen clearly from where I stood. The message read, "She doesn't know yet. I'm keeping my promise to her mother, but she's starting to ask questions. I'm not sure how much longer I can wait." I stepped back silently, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Her mother. My mother. Eleanor wasn't just a random connection. She was actively in contact with someone about me keeping promises, guarding secrets. The woman who had become my mentor, my lifeline, my first real ally in years. She had known who I was from the moment I walked through the door. And she had been hiding something from me ever since. I never confronted Eleanor about the text message I saw that night. Part of me was afraid of what the confrontation might reveal, afraid that the one person who had shown me genuine kindness might turn out to be another player in my father's long game of manipulation. But a larger part of me had learned something important during my time with Eleanor. Trust is built through actions, not explanations, and Eleanor's actions had been nothing but generous. Whatever secrets she was keeping, whatever promises she had made to my mother, I chose to believe that her intentions were good. I chose to wait for the truth to reveal itself in its own time. I didn't realize how little time we had left. 3 years after that first meeting, after countless hours of mentorship and hundreds of small kindnesses that slowly rebuilt my belief in human decency, Eleanor called me into her office with a gravity in her voice I had never heard before. She sat behind her desk, looking smaller than usual. Her elegant posture somehow diminished her sharp eyes, carrying a weariness that hadn't been there the week before. "I have cancer," she said simply. "Stage 4. The doctors say I have months, maybe less. There's nothing to be done except prepare." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the room tilt, felt my hands grip the arms of my chair as if I might fall without something to anchor me. Eleanor, brilliant, tireless. Eleanor, who had pulled me out of my car and taught me to believe in myself, was dying. The universe, it seemed, had decided I wasn't allowed to keep anyone who loved me. But Eleanor didn't succumb to despair, and she refused to let me succumb either. Instead of withdrawing into illness, she accelerated her mission with an intensity that bordered on ferocious. She worked longer hours than her doctors advised, met with every contact she had cultivated over decades in nonprofit work, and focused all her remaining energy on one goal, preparing me for independence. "You're going to survive without me," she said during one of our late-night sessions. "You're going to do more than survive. You're going to build something extraordinary. And I'm going to spend whatever time I have left making sure you're ready." In her final weeks, when the cancer had stolen most of her strength and she could no longer make it into the office, Eleanor called me to her bedside. Her apartment was small but filled with books, photographs, and the accumulated treasures of a life well lived. She lay propped against pillows, her skin pale, but her eyes still sharp, still seeing everything. She handed me an envelope thick and heavy in my hands. "Open it," she said. Inside was $5,000 in cash, along with a letter written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. I read it while she watched, her expression peaceful, despite the pain I knew she was enduring. The letter read, "Build something that sets you free. Build something that helps women like your mother, like me, like you. This money is not charity, it's investment. I expect returns measured in lives changed. You have everything you need inside you, Grace. You always have. Now go prove it to the world." I tried to refuse. $5,000 was a fortune to me, and Eleanor had medical bills, had expenses, had 100 better uses for this money than gambling on my unproven abilities. But she closed my fingers around the envelope with surprising strength and shook her head. "This is exactly what I want to do with it," she said. "Don't argue with a dying woman. It's rude." I laughed through my tears, and she smiled, and for a moment the shadow of death retreated, just far enough for us to simply be two women who loved each other, mentor and student, bound by something deeper than circumstance. Eleanor died 6 months later. I was holding her hand when she took her final breath, and I stayed with her long after she was gone, unwilling to let go of the last person who had truly seen me. I buried her with the photograph of her and my mother, thinking she would want to be reunited with her best friend in whatever came next. And then I did what she had asked me to do. I built something. With the $5,000, I launched a small online service designed to help older women update their resumes and navigate the increasingly digital job application process. I knew this demographic intimately. I had worked with them at Second Chances, had heard their stories, understood their fears and frustrations. They had skills and experience that employers desperately needed, but they were being filtered out by algorithms that favored keywords they didn't know and technology they hadn't mastered. I wanted to bridge that gap. The first year was a disaster. A web developer I hired took half my money and delivered a website that barely functioned. I spent weeks trying to fix problems I didn't yet understand, teaching myself coding through online tutorials and sleepless nights of trial and error. When I finally launched, I undercut my own prices to compete with established services, charging so little that I couldn't cover my basic expenses, even when I had clients. I worked 80-hour weeks and ate ramen noodles and watched my savings dwindle toward zero. But each failure taught me something. The scam artist developer taught me to verify credentials and never pay in full up front. The pricing mistakes taught me to value my work and understand that cheap doesn't mean accessible, it means disposable. The technical struggles taught me skills I would use for the rest of my career. I learned to spot predators, to build systems that didn't depend on luck, to document everything obsessively as protection against future betrayal. Slowly, painfully, my business began to stabilize. I raised my prices and watched my client base grow rather than shrink. I developed a proprietary algorithm that matched older workers with positions suited to their experience, factoring in dozens of variables that traditional job sites ignored. I built relationships with employers who valued the reliability and work ethic that older employees brought. Year by year, month by month, I was building something real. Then someone tried to steal it. His name was Marcus Webb, and he had presented himself as a potential investor impressed by my growing platform and eager to discuss partnership opportunities. I was flattered by his attention and naive about his intentions. I showed him my technology, explained my matching algorithm, shared the proprietary methods I had developed through years of trial and error. He nodded thoughtfully, asked intelligent questions, and left with everything he needed to build a competing business. 6 months later, I discovered a new platform had launched, with features suspiciously similar to my own. The matching algorithm was almost identical to mine, the one I had foolishly demonstrated in detail. Marcus Webb's name was nowhere on the company, but his fingerprints were everywhere. I was devastated. Years of work stolen by someone I had trusted. Eleanor's investment seemingly wasted on a failure who couldn't even protect her own intellectual property. Then I realized something crucial. The algorithm Marcus stole was version 1, the original system I had developed and demonstrated, but I had never stopped improving it. In the months since his visit, I had developed version 2, a dramatically superior system that incorporated everything I had learned from my early mistakes. The technology he had stolen was already obsolete. More importantly, I had documented everything. Every iteration, every timestamp, every email exchange was saved and organized, creating a paper trail that proved my ownership beyond any doubt. The stolen work would eventually become evidence, and the platform Marcus had built on my stolen foundation would become something I could pursue legally when the time was right. I filed my documentation away and continued building. I had learned patience from Eleanor. I had learned that justice sometimes moves slowly, and I had learned that the best revenge is success. Then one afternoon I received a legal notice that stopped me cold. The notice informed me that Marcus Webb had sold his company, the one built on my stolen algorithm, to a corporate entity I had never heard of. The sale price was substantial, and the notice suggested potential intellectual property claims might be complicated by the transfer of ownership. It took me 3 weeks of digging to uncover the truth about that corporate entity. Shell companies within shell companies, layers of legal obfuscation designed to hide the true owner. When I finally reached the center of the maze, I found a name I knew all too well. The company that had purchased my stolen work was secretly owned by my father. The discovery that my father secretly owned the company, built on my stolen algorithm, changed something fundamental in my approach to business. For years, I had been building defensively, protecting myself from random predators and opportunistic thieves. Now I understood that the threat wasn't random at all. It was targeted, coordinated, and it came from the same source that had been trying to destroy me since childhood. My father wasn't content with stealing my past. He wanted to control my future too. But knowledge is power, and now I had knowledge he didn't know I possessed. He thought his ownership was hidden behind layers of shell companies. He thought I would never trace the theft back to him. He was wrong on both counts, and I intended to use that advantage when the time was right. First, though, I needed to build something worth protecting. Using every lesson from my failures, the scam artists, the stolen technology, the years of struggle that had taught me more than any business school could, I launched my real company. Not the tentative first attempt I had started with Eleanor's money, but a comprehensive platform designed to solve a problem I understood intimately, helping women over 50 return to the workforce after the career gaps that society used to dismiss them. I called it Renewed Purpose, and I built it from the foundation up with intention and care. The platform offered everything I had seen women struggle to find on their own: skills assessment tools that helped identify transferable abilities they didn't know they had, resume optimization services that translated decades of experience into language that modern hiring algorithms could recognize, interview coaching that addressed the specific anxieties older workers face: the fear of being seen as outdated, the uncertainty about technology, the internalized belief that their best years were behind them. But the most important feature wasn't any single service. It was the community. I created forums where women could connect with others facing similar challenges. I organized virtual support groups led by women who had successfully navigated their own career transitions. I built a network of mentors, many of them former clients, who wanted to pay forward the help they had received, who provided guidance and encouragement to newcomers. The platform became more than a job-finding service. It became a place where women over 50 could feel seen, valued, and supported. I knew this demographic because I had spent years with them at Eleanor's nonprofit. I had heard their stories, witnessed their struggles, and understood the particular cruelty of being dismissed as irrelevant simply because of age. These were women with decades of experience, wisdom earned through both triumph and tragedy, skills honed across careers that had spanned transformations in technology and culture. They weren't unemployable. They were overlooked, underestimated, and abandoned by a job market that worshipped youth above all else. I understood their fears because I had lived my own version of them. I understood their strength because I had witnessed it in Eleanor, in Maggie, in countless women who had rebuilt their lives after everything fell apart. And I understood their desperate need to be seen as valuable again because that need had driven my entire journey. The company grew because we solved real problems for real people. I partnered with corporations that were beginning to recognize the value of age diversity in their workforces. Companies struggling with high turnover among younger employees discovered that older workers brought stability, reliability, and institutional knowledge that couldn't be taught in training programs. I created specialized programs for women recovering from divorce, widowhood, or health crises, life transitions that often forced them out of careers they had never intended to leave. Each success story generated more referrals. Each transformed life became a testament to what was possible. Within 5 years, Renewed Purpose had helped over 10,000 women find meaningful employment. Not just any jobs positions that matched their skills, compensated them fairly, and treated them with the dignity they deserved. I received letters from women who had gone from food stamps to management positions. I heard from daughters who thanked me for giving their mothers back their sense of purpose. I watched former clients return as mentors, completing a cycle of support that Eleanor would have loved to see. Media began to take notice. Local news outlets ran stories about our impact. Business magazines profiled our unusual model. I was invited to speak at conferences where I often felt like an outsider. A woman in her 30s surrounded by tech entrepreneurs half my age talking about disruption and scaling and exit strategies. My business philosophy differed radically from Silicon Valley culture, and I made no apologies for it. I refused venture capital that would have pressured me to prioritize growth over impact. Investors approached regularly waving term sheets with impressive numbers and promises of rapid expansion. But their models all involved the same trade-off: take their money, hit their growth targets, and accept their control over major decisions. I had learned from Eleanor that control was everything. I had watched my mother lose control of her own story. I had experienced what happened when someone else held power over your future. So I said no again and again to investors who wanted to reshape renewed purpose into something faster, bigger, and less focused on the mission that mattered. Instead, I grew organically, reinvesting profits rather than chasing external funding. I paid my employees above market rates because I remembered what it felt like to work 3 jobs and still not afford rent. I offered flexible hours for caregivers because I knew that women's lives rarely fit into rigid 9-to-5 schedules. I maintained majority ownership of my company, keeping 51% of shares no matter how many partnership opportunities came my way. Eleanor's voice echoed in my decisions. Control your own story, or someone else will control it for you. By the time I turned 36, Renewed Purpose was valued at $15 million. Not a unicorn by Silicon Valley standards, but built entirely on my terms, serving people I genuinely cared about, generating profit without sacrificing purpose. I had a team of 40 employees who believed in our mission. I had partnerships with over 200 corporations. I had a reputation in the industry as someone who did things differently and proved that differently could work. For the first time in my life, I felt something resembling security. That's when the mysterious investor appeared. His name was Richard Thornton, and his assistant contacted us, requesting a private meeting with me personally. His proposal, conveyed through preliminary emails, seemed remarkably generous, a substantial investment that would allow us to expand nationally with terms that appeared to protect our mission and my control. On paper, it looked almost too good to be true, which is why I did what I always did before any significant business decision. I ran a thorough background check. The results made me uneasy. Richard Thornton had ties to 6 businesses that had failed in suspicious circumstances over the past 15 years. The pattern was consistent. He invested in promising companies founded by women, provided initial support that looked helpful. Then, somehow, the companies collapsed through financial irregularities, leadership conflicts, or sudden market pressures that seemed almost orchestrated. The founders emerged devastated, their businesses destroyed, their reputations damaged. And Richard Thornton always emerged holding valuable assets he had acquired for pennies on the dollar. I sat in my office staring at the background check results, feeling a familiar chill settle into my bones. This investor wasn't offering opportunity. He was offering a trap, one that had been designed specifically for women like me. The only question was whether he was acting alone or whether someone else was pulling his strings. The background check on Richard Thornton revealed enough red flags to make me decline his meeting request outright. But before I could send my polite refusal, another name surfaced in my research: Marcus Webb, the same man who had stolen my algorithm years earlier, now apparently working in partnership with Thornton on various acquisitions. The connection felt too convenient to be coincidence, and I decided that sometimes the best way to understand your enemies is to let them show you who they are. I accepted the meeting, but I prepared for it like a general preparing for battle. Marcus Webb arrived at my office on a Tuesday morning, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than my first car, his smile wide and warm and completely false. He had aged since I last saw him, silver threading through his dark hairlines, deepening around his eyes, but his manner remained the same, charming, confident, utterly convinced of his own superiority. "Grace," he said, extending his hand as if we were old friends rather than adversaries. "It's wonderful to see you again. I've been following your company's growth with great admiration. What you've built here is truly remarkable." I shook his hand briefly, keeping my expression neutral. He gave no indication that he remembered stealing my technology, no flicker of guilt or acknowledgement. Perhaps he had done it so many times to so many people that individual victims blurred together, or perhaps he simply didn't care. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Webb. Please sit down." He settled into the chair across from my desk and launched into a presentation that was clearly designed to flatter me into submission. He praised my vision, calling it transformative and exactly what the market needs. He cited our metrics with impressive accuracy: our client retention rates, our partnership growth, our media coverage, clearly having done his homework. He spoke eloquently about social impact and mission-driven business, hitting every talking point he thought would appeal to someone like me. Then he made his offer. He wanted to acquire 51% of Renewed Purpose for a sum that represented roughly a quarter of our actual value. He dressed it up in financial jargon, current market conditions, risk adjustment factors, growth potential discounting. But the translation was simple. He wanted to buy control of my company for far less than it was worth using, justifications that existed only in his imagination. I had seen this playbook before. I had watched it destroy women at Eleanor's nonprofit, had heard their stories of investors who swooped in with promises and walked away with everything. Lowball the offer, pressure the founder, acquire the company, strip it for parts, discard whoever built it. The pattern was so consistent it was almost boring in its predictability. "That's an interesting proposal," I said, keeping my voice carefully pleasant. "But I'm afraid I'll have to decline. The valuation doesn't reflect our actual market position, and I'm not interested in giving up majority control under any circumstances." Marcus's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I understand your hesitation, but I think you may be overestimating your leverage. The market for workforce development is becoming increasingly competitive. Without significant capital investment, you may find yourself struggling to maintain your current position. My offer provides security." "My current position is quite secure," I replied. "We're profitable, we're growing, and we have no debt. I appreciate your interest, but the answer is no." The meeting ended shortly after Marcus departing with assurances that he would leave the door open. Should I reconsider? I watched him go with the calm certainty that I had made the right decision and the unsettling awareness that this encounter was not over. Men like Marcus Webb didn't accept rejection gracefully. They simply changed tactics. The next morning, I hired a lawyer named Samuel Chen to conduct deeper due diligence on Webb and his associates. Samuel came highly recommended by a colleague I trusted, a woman who had used his services during a difficult contract negotiation, and praised his meticulous attention to detail. He was young, serious, and possessed the kind of careful thoroughness that made me feel confident my interests would be protected. "I want to know everything about Marcus Webb," I told him. "His business history, his partnerships, his investment patterns, every company he's ever been involved with, especially those founded by women." Samuel nodded, making notes in precise handwriting. "Any particular reason you're focusing on women-founded companies?" "Because I think there's a pattern, and patterns can be proven." It took Samuel 3 weeks to compile his research, and when he presented it to me, I understood why his face looked troubled. Marcus Webb had targeted at least 6 women-founded companies over the past decade. The approach was consistent: identify a promising business, make initial contact under the guise of partnership or investment, then systematically undermine the company until acquisition became inevitable. Sometimes he used financial pressure, calling in debts, disrupting funding sources, spreading rumors that scared away other investors. Sometimes he used personal attacks, questioning the founder's competence, her mental stability, her suitability for leadership. The methods varied, but the outcome was always the same. Webb acquired the company for a fraction of its worth, extracted whatever value remained, and moved on to his next target. "He's a predator," Samuel said quietly. "A sophisticated one, but a predator nonetheless. He specifically targets women because he believes they're easier to intimidate, less likely to fight back legally." I absorbed this information with cold anger but not surprise. I had known men like Marcus Webb my entire life. I had been raised by one. Then Samuel showed me the document that changed everything. "There's more," he said, sliding a folder across the table with hands that trembled slightly. "Webb doesn't operate alone. He's part of a network of investors who share information, coordinate approaches, distribute risk across multiple acquisitions. And one name appears repeatedly in his business connections. He opened the folder to reveal organizational charts, ownership documents, financial records, tracing relationships between various corporate entities, and there at the center of the web was a name I knew too well: my father. "Your father's investment group has been monitoring your company for over 2 years," Samuel continued, his voice careful. "They've tracked your revenue growth, your client acquisition rates, your expansion plans. Webb's offer wasn't random. It was coordinated with your father's organization. The lowball terms, the pressure tactics, even the timing of the approach, it all traces back to the same source." I stared at the documents, feeling the pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. My father hadn't given up on controlling me when I left home at 18. He had simply changed his approach, waiting until I built something worth taking, then positioning his allies to acquire it from me. "There's one more thing," Samuel said, and now his voice held something closer to shock. "During my research into Webb's technology holdings, I found patents related to workforce matching algorithms. The technical specifications are almost identical to work you described, developing early in your career work that was stolen by Webb years ago." He handed me a final document, a side-by-side comparison of patent filings and timestamps. "Your father's company was built on technology that matches your stolen algorithm exactly," Samuel said. "Webb didn't act alone when he took your work. Your father funded the theft. He orchestrated it. He's been profiting from your innovation for years while simultaneously trying to destroy the company you built afterward." I sat in silence, holding evidence of a betrayal that spanned decades. My father hadn't just stolen my childhood, my mother, my education. He had stolen my intellectual property, built an empire on my work, and was now trying to steal my company too. But this time, I had something I lacked at 18. I had power, I had resources, I had documentation, and I had the will to fight back. The evidence Samuel had gathered about my father's involvement sat in a locked drawer in my office, waiting for the right moment to deploy. I had learned patience from Eleanor, learned that justice sometimes requires strategic timing rather than immediate action. I was building my case, strengthening my position, preparing for a confrontation that would happen on my terms rather than my father's. Then my company was attacked and everything I had carefully constructed began to crumble. The breach happened on a Wednesday morning in March. I arrived at the office to find my phone already exploding with notifications, voicemails, text messages, emails flooding in faster than I could process them. My assistant met me at the door with a face pale with shock, holding a tablet that displayed a tabloid website I had never heard of. The headline screamed across the screen, "Desperate job seekers exposed by failed platform, thousands of personal secrets leaked." Someone had stolen our client database, not just names and contact information, but the deeply personal details our clients had trusted us with. Employment histories that included terminations and conflicts, personal struggles shared in confidence during coaching sessions, medical information disclosed as part of career planning, financial difficulties, family problems, the intimate vulnerabilities that people reveal only when they believe they are safe. All of it was now public, spread across the internet, like a virus impossible to contain. The next 72 hours were a nightmare I wouldn't wish on anyone. My phone rang constantly with cancellations from clients who could no longer trust us with their information. Corporate partners called to express concern and quietly distanced themselves from the controversy. Legal threats arrived by email and certified mail, former clients demanding accountability for the exposure of their private lives. Media outlets requested comments, their questions sharp with accusation. I worked around the clock, sleeping in my office when I slept at all personally, calling every affected client to apologize and offer whatever support we could provide. Some screamed at me, some cried. Some simply hung up without speaking their silence, more devastating than any words could have been. Years of trust, thousands of relationships carefully built through genuine care and consistent support, all of it evaporating in days. But even as I fought to contain the immediate damage, a deeper investigation was underway. I had hired the best cybersecurity team I could afford, specialists who had worked with major corporations and government agencies, and I gave them one directive: find out how this happened and who was responsible. What they discovered made the data breach itself seem almost secondary. The hack had not originated from outside our systems. Someone had accessed our servers using internal credentials, administrator-level access that should not have existed in our security architecture. The credentials had been created 6 months earlier, hidden within our system like a sleeper agent waiting to be activated. Whoever did this had been planning for half a year, waiting for the right moment to strike. More disturbing still was what had been leaked alongside our client data. Hidden among the thousands of exposed files were documents that had nothing to do with renewed purpose documents about me personally. Childhood medical records I hadn't seen in decades. School transcripts from elementary through high school. And most damning of all, copies of the forged financial documents from when I was 14, the ones bearing my falsified signature on loans I had never agreed to. Someone hadn't just wanted to destroy my company. Someone had wanted to expose my past, to drag into the light every piece of evidence that connected me to my father's fraud. The attack was designed to hurt my business and my reputation simultaneously, to leave me vulnerable on every possible front. This wasn't corporate espionage. This was personal destruction. Samuel worked with the cybersecurity team to trace the breach to its source. The technical details were complex IP addresses, network pathways, encrypted communications, but the conclusion was simple. The attack had been launched from a single point of origin, a device registered to a home network in the suburbs of our city. Lila's home network. I stared at the report, feeling a strange mixture of fury and disbelief. My sister, my half-sister, the golden child who had unknowingly been used as a weapon against me our entire lives, had apparently orchestrated an attack designed to destroy everything I had built. The evidence was clear, documented, undeniable. And that was exactly what bothered me. The evidence was too clear, too clean. Too perfectly arranged to point directly at Lila with no ambiguity or alternative explanation. In my experience, real crimes left messier trails. Real criminals made mistakes, left gaps, created contradictions that required interpretation. This evidence looked like it had been gift-wrapped and delivered specifically for our investigators to find. I knew Lila. I had grown up watching her, studying her, trying to understand why she was loved while I was discarded. Whatever her flaws, and there were many, technical sophistication was not among them. Lila struggled to update her phone software. She called IT support when her email wouldn't load. The idea that she had personally orchestrated a data breach requiring 6 months of preparation and administrator-level system access was absurd. Someone had used Lila's network to launch the attack. Either she had been manipulated into participating without understanding what she was enabling, or she had been framed entirely. Neither option suggested she was the mastermind. Both options pointed to someone else, someone with the resources, the technical capability, and the motivation to destroy me while deflecting blame onto my sister. I knew exactly who that someone was. I called Samuel to my office late that evening after the rest of the staff had gone home and the building was quiet. He arrived looking exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. From the long hours we had all been working, his usually neat appearance rumpled and worn. "I need to talk to you about the evidence pointing to Lila," I said without preamble. "It's too convenient, too obvious. Someone planted it." Samuel's face, already pale from fatigue, went several shades whiter. He stood in the doorway of my office, and I watched his expression shift through several emotions I couldn't quite identify. Surprise, guilt, fear, and finally something that looked almost like relief. "You're right," he said quietly. "The evidence was planted. I know because I helped plant it." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible. "What did you say?" Samuel stepped into my office and closed the door behind him. His hands were trembling, and when he spoke again, his voice shook with it. "There's something I need to tell you about who I really work for and why I was placed in your life. But first," he gestured toward the chair across from my desk. "You should sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything you think you know about the past 3 years." I remained standing, my heart pounding, my mind racing through implications I didn't want to face. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me everything." Samuel stood in my office with his hands clasped in front of him like a man awaiting sentencing, and I suppose in a way he was. The confession he had just begun hung between us, incomplete, but already devastating. I remained standing, my fingers gripping the edge of my desk, waiting for him to continue. "Your father hired me 2 years ago." Samuel set his voice steady, despite the tremor I could see in his shoulders. He approached me through an intermediary, a senior partner at my firm, who owed him favors. The assignment was simple: infiltrate your business, earn your trust report on your activities, and identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He paid me 3 times my normal rate. He promised to advance my career in ways I couldn't achieve on my own. I listened in silence, feeling each word land like a blow to my chest. "I was supposed to be your friend," Samuel continued. "Your trusted advisor. I was supposed to learn everything about your company, your finances, your partnerships, your expansion plans, your personal relationships. And I was supposed to feed all of that information back to your father so he could use it against you." "The colleague who recommended you," I said, my voice flat. "The woman who praised your work during her contract negotiation." Samuel nodded miserably. "She works for your father, too. The whole thing was staged. Your father has been building a network around you for years. People in your industry contacts who seem independent but report back to him. You've been surrounded without knowing it." The rage that surged through me was so intense I had to close my eyes against it. 2 years. Samuel had been in my life for 2 years, sitting in meetings, reviewing contracts, offering advice I had trusted and followed. Every strategic decision I had made during that time had been observed, analyzed, and reported to the man who had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. Another betrayal. Another person who had used my trust as a weapon. I thought of Eleanor, of the years she had spent teaching me to believe that some people could be trusted, that kindness existed without ulterior motive. Had that been naive? Had I been a fool to ever let anyone close? "Why are you telling me this now?" I demanded, my eyes still closed. "Why confess when you could have continued reporting? Why risk everything you've gained?" "Because something changed." Samuel's voice cracked slightly. "When I took this assignment, you were just a target. A name in a file, a problem to be solved for a wealthy client. But then I actually met you. I watched you work 18-hour days to save your company after the data breach. I saw you personally call every affected client, apologizing, offering help, treating them like human beings instead of liabilities. I learned your story, what your father did to you, what you overcame, what you built from nothing." He paused, and when I opened my eyes, I saw tears streaming down his face. "You're not what he told me you were," Samuel said quietly. "He described you as unstable, dangerous, a threat to the family who needed to be contained. But you're none of those things. You're the most ethical person I've ever worked with." And I realized I was helping a monster destroy someone who didn't deserve it. "So you want absolution," I said coldly. "You want me to forgive you because you feel guilty." "No." Samuel shook his head firmly. "I want to help you. I want to switch sides. I can be a double agent, continue reporting to your father, but feed him false information while actually serving you. I know his plans, his network, his methods. I can give you intelligence he doesn't know you have. I can help you fight back." My first instinct was to refuse, to fire him, immediately expose his espionage, and watch his legal career crumble. The satisfaction of that revenge would be immediate and complete. But Eleanor's voice whispered in my memory, calm and wise. "Emotion is information, not instruction. Feel it, understand it, then decide with your mind, not your wounds." I had learned too much from her to react impulsively. I had spent too many years building strategic patience to abandon it now. "I need 24 hours, I said finally. "Stay away from the office. Don't contact my father. Don't contact anyone. I'll have my decision by tomorrow evening." Samuel nodded, relief and anxiety warring on his face. "Thank you for not—" "Don't thank me yet. We're not friends. We're not allies. Right now you're a problem I'm deciding how to solve. Go home and wait." After he left, I sat alone in my office for a long time thinking. The next morning, I implemented a test. I contacted Samuel 3 times throughout the day, each time sharing a different piece of confidential information about my company. The first communication mentioned a potential partnership with a healthcare corporation, fictional but plausible. The second discussed expansion plans into the Midwest market, also fictional. The third revealed concerns about a board member's loyalty, entirely fabricated. Each piece of information was distinct enough that if any of them reached my father, I would know exactly which communication Samuel had passed along. If he was still reporting, the trail would be clear. I waited 3 days, using contacts I had cultivated over years to monitor my father's network for any reaction to my planted intelligence. I watched for signs that he was adjusting his strategy based on new information, that he was making moves that corresponded to what I had told Samuel. Nothing. No response to the healthcare partnership. No reaction to the Midwest expansion. No inquiry about the board member. Samuel hadn't reported to my father in at least 3 weeks. His confession appeared to be genuine. I called him back to my office on the 4th day. "You passed the test," I said without preamble. "I'm willing to use you as a double agent, but understand the conditions clearly." Samuel sat up straighter, hope and wariness mingling in his expression. "Every communication with my father must be documented and provided to me within 24 hours. Every piece of false information you feed him must be approved by me in advance. No improvisation, no independent decisions. You will maintain your role as his spy while actually serving my interests, and you will do exactly what I tell you when I tell you without question." "I understand," Samuel said. "I'm not finished." I leaned forward across my desk, making sure he could see the steel in my eyes. "If I detect one sign of betrayal, one piece of information that reaches my father without my approval, one hint that you're playing both sides, I will destroy your legal career. I have documented evidence of your corporate espionage. I have recordings of this conversation. I will ensure that you never practice law again, and that everyone in this industry knows exactly what you did." Samuel swallowed hard, but nodded. "I accept those terms." "Good." I sat back. "Now tell me what you know about my father's current plans." For the next 2 hours, Samuel detailed everything he had learned during his time as my father's spy. The network of informants, the shell companies, the coordinated strategy to acquire my business through pressure and manipulation. Most of it confirmed what I had already suspected, but some details were new and valuable. When he finished, I had one final question. "Is there anything immediate I should know about any plans already in motion?" Samuel hesitated, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a printed email. "This came through yesterday," he said. "Your father is planning something for Christmas dinner. He's invited the entire family, your stepmother Lila, extended relatives, business associates, and he's specifically demanding that you attend." I took the email and read it. The language was carefully neutral, framed as a reconciliation, a chance for the family to heal old wounds. "He called it the reckoning," Samuel added quietly. "In his private communications, that's the phrase he used. He believes he's going to end this at Christmas. He believes he's going to win." I folded the email and slipped it into my pocket. My father wanted a reckoning. He wanted to face me at his table, surrounded by his allies on his terms. He was going to get one, but not the way he imagined. The Christmas reckoning my father was planning gave me 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks to gather intelligence, to position my pieces, to transform his trap into my opportunity. But before I could face him, I needed to understand something that had been bothering me since Samuel's confession, Lila's role in all of this. The evidence pointing to her network had been planted, Samuel admitted, but that didn't explain how her network had been used in the first place. Someone had accessed her home system. Someone had made her complicit, whether she understood it or not. I needed to know if my sister was my enemy or another victim. I arranged to meet Lila at a small cafe in a neighborhood neither of us frequented, a quiet place with dim lighting and private booths where we wouldn't be recognized. I arrived early and chose a table in the back corner, positioning myself where I could watch the door. When Lila walked in 15 minutes later, I barely recognized her. The golden child I remembered from family gatherings, confident, polished, secure in her position as the favorite, had been replaced by someone who looked hunted. Lila's eyes darted around the cafe before landing on me, and her shoulders were tight with tension as she approached the table. She sat down across from me without removing her coat, as if she might need to flee at any moment. "I didn't think you'd actually come," I said. "I almost didn't." Her voice was hoarse. "I figured this was some kind of trap, a chance to humiliate me the way you humiliated me at Thanksgiving last year." I remembered that Thanksgiving, a smaller family gathering where I had quietly corrected one of Lila's business claims, exposing an exaggeration she had made about her company's performance. It had been a minor moment, barely worth noting, but clearly it had left a mark. "I'm not here to humiliate you," I said. "I'm here to ask you a question, and I need you to tell me the truth." Lila's defensive posture tightened further. "What question?" I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and steady. "Did you leak my company's data, or did someone use you?" The effect of my words was immediate and devastating. Lila's composure, already fragile, shattered completely. Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them, and she covered her mouth with her hand to muffle the sob that escaped. "I didn't know," she whispered through her fingers. "I swear to God, Grace, I didn't know what it would do." "He told me it was just a monitoring device, something to track your business activities. He said it was for the family's protection. He said you were planning something that would hurt all of us." "Who told you this?" "Dad," Lila nodded miserably, tears still streaming. "He came to my house 3 months ago. He said you had become dangerous, that your success had made you unstable, that you were gathering evidence to destroy the family. He said he needed to monitor your activities to protect everyone, me, Patricia, the business, everything. All I had to do was plug a device into my home router, that's it. Just plug it in and forget about it." "And you believed him?" "Of course I believed him." Lila's voice rose with desperate intensity. "He's been telling me my whole life that you were the threat, that you were jealous, vindictive, that you'd burn everything down if you ever got the chance. He said, Mom, your mom was the same way, dangerous, unstable. That's why she had to leave. He told me I was protecting the family by keeping you contained." I absorbed this information with a strange mixture of anger and pity. My father had weaponized Lila against me from childhood, programming her to see me as an enemy rather than a sister. She hadn't been his favorite because he loved her more. She had been his favorite because she was more useful as a tool. "He threatened me too," Lila continued, her voice dropping. "When I hesitated about the device, he said if I didn't cooperate, he would fire me from the company and reveal something devastating about my past. He didn't say what. He just said I would lose everything." "He holds leverage over everyone," I said quietly. "Everyone." Lila wiped her eyes with a napkin, smearing mascara across her cheeks. "Our grandmother, before she died, he had something on her too. Patricia does whatever he says because he knows things about her first marriage that she's terrified will come out. Business partners, employees, even the board members. He collects secrets like other people collect stamps, and he uses them." I thought about the forged documents bearing my signature, the business venture that collapsed when I was 14. My father's entire empire was built on leverage, on knowing things about people that gave him power over them. "There's something else," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone." I waited. "I've never seen my own birth certificate, the original one. Dad keeps it locked away somewhere along with other documents he calls the family security files. I asked about it once when I was applying for my first passport, and he got so angry I never asked again. He said some documents were too important to be accessed casually." My mind flashed to the birth certificate I had found years ago, the one with my father's name and the blank space where a mother should have been. "But I overheard something," Lila continued. "About 5 years ago, right before Grandmother died. She and Dad were arguing in his study, and I was in the hallway. I heard her say, 'You can't keep this hidden forever.' And he said—" Lila paused, swallowing hard. "He said, if those girls ever find out the truth, they'll never forgive us." "Those girls. Both of us." "What truth?" I asked, though I already suspected I knew. I don't know. Lila shook her head. But it involves both of us. And I think it involves our mother's, yours, and whoever mine is. I've spent years trying not to think about it, trying to be the good daughter, trying to believe that ignorance was the same as safety. But it's not. I see that now. She reached into her purse and pulled out something small and metallic. A key. I stole this from Dad's study last week, she said, placing it on the table between us. It opens his private safe, the one where he keeps the family security files. Whatever truth he's been hiding about me, about you, about our mothers, it's in there. I looked at the key, feeling its weight, even before I touched it. Why are you giving this to me? Lila met my eyes, and for the first time I saw something in her expression that wasn't fear or resentment or competition. It was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had spent a lifetime performing a role she never chose. Because I'm too scared to look alone, she said, but I'm more scared of never knowing, and I think, her voice broke slightly, I think maybe we should find out together, whatever the truth is, even if it destroys everything. I picked up the key and closed my fingers around it. It won't destroy everything, I said quietly. It might finally set us free. The key Lila had given me felt heavier than its small size should allow, weighted with the promise of answers I had been seeking for over 2 decades. We waited 4 days for the right opportunity. A business trip that would take our father to Chicago for a conference, leaving the house empty, except for the housekeeper, who worked mornings only. Lila confirmed Patricia would be at her weekly bridge club until evening. We would have a window of several hours, enough time to find what we were looking for. I picked Lila up at a shopping center 3 miles from our father's house, and we drove the rest of the way in tense silence. She looked as nervous as I felt, her fingers twisting together in her lap, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if she might change her mind at any moment. "You can still back out," I said as we turned onto the familiar street. "I can do this alone." "No." Lila's voice was firm despite its tremor. "I need to know. Whatever's in there, I need to see it for myself." We parked 2 blocks away and approached the house on foot, using the side entrance that Lila still had a key for. The house was silent when we entered, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the polished floors I remembered from childhood. Everything looked exactly as it had when I was young, the same furniture, the same artwork, the same oppressive perfection that had made me feel like an intruder in my own home. Lila led me to our father's study, a room I had rarely been permitted to enter. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light. The desk where he conducted his business was massive and imposing, designed to make anyone sitting across from him feel small. "The safe is behind the bookshelf," Lila whispered, though we were alone. "There's a panel that swings out." She showed me the mechanism, a hidden latch disguised as a decorative molding, and the section of bookshelf swung open to reveal a wall safe with a key lock rather than a combination. My hands trembled as I inserted the key Lila had stolen. It turned smoothly, and the safe door opened with a soft click. Inside was a lifetime of secrets. The safe was deeper than it appeared, packed with documents organized into labeled folders, bundles of letters held together with rubber bands, photographs in yellowed envelopes, and official-looking papers bearing seals and signatures. I pulled out my phone and began photographing everything, knowing we might only have this chance once. Lila stood beside me, her breathing shallow, watching as I documented decades of hidden truth. The first folder I opened contained financial records, bank statements, investment accounts, property deeds. Most of it meant nothing to me, columns of numbers tracking wealth I had never been allowed to share. But one document caught my attention, a settlement agreement dated the year my mother left. I read it with growing horror. The agreement stipulated that my mother would receive a lump sum payment of $50,000 in exchange for signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. She was prohibited from contacting me discussing the terms of her departure with anyone or making any public statements about our family. The penalty for violation was severe, complete termination of any future access to me, plus legal action that would consume whatever resources she had. My mother hadn't abandoned me. She had been paid to leave and threatened into silence. "Grace." Lila's voice was strange. She was holding another document, her face pale. "You need to see this." She handed me a birth certificate. Her birth certificate, the original one, she had never been allowed to see. Her father's name was listed clearly, but so was her mother's, a woman named Catherine Wells, someone I had never heard of. Attached to the birth certificate was a series of letters and legal documents that told a devastating story. Catherine Wells had been our father's mistress for 3 years during his marriage to my mother. When she became pregnant with Lila, our father had arranged for her to give birth quietly and then paid her to relinquish custody. My mother discovered the affair and the child when Lila was 2 years old, and that discovery had been the catalyst for everything that followed. "I'm the reason," Lila whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm the reason your mother left. He brought me into the family and she couldn't." "No." I gripped her arm firmly. "You were a child, a baby. None of this was your fault. He made these choices, not you." But even as I comforted her, I was reaching for another folder, one labeled in my father's handwriting with words that made my blood run cold. The incident, 1998. Inside were the documents I had discovered fragments of years ago, now complete and damning in their totality. Loan applications, credit agreements, business and corporation papers, all bearing my forged signature, all dated when I was 14 years old. My father had used my identity, my social security number, to secure funding for a real estate venture that had subsequently collapsed. When the business failed, he had quietly absorbed the debts into other accounts, hiding the fraud behind layers of corporate restructuring. He had made his teenage daughter legally responsible for his failed investments. He had committed identity theft against his own child. But the folder contained something else too, something that made my heart stop entirely. Letters. Dozens of them written in Eleanor's careful handwriting, addressed to someone named M at various addresses over the span of 15 years. I read them with growing amazement. Eleanor had been writing to my mother, updating her on my progress, my achievements, my struggles, sending photographs from my graduations, my first apartment, my company launch, keeping my mother connected to my life through a secret correspondence that had continued until Eleanor's death. My mother had known everything. She had watched me from a distance, unable to reach out, but never truly gone. At the very bottom of the safe, beneath all the folders and documents, I found one final item, a sealed envelope slightly crumpled, bearing my name in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, despite the passage of decades. For Grace. Open only after my death. My mother's handwriting. My mother's words. But attached to the envelope was something that made no sense, a postal receipt with a date from just 6 months ago. Someone had received this envelope recently. Someone had handled it, held it, perhaps considered sending it. The envelope had never been mailed. It had been sitting in my father's safe for 6 months waiting. I turned to Lila, my voice barely a whisper. "This is dated 6 months ago. She wrote this 6 months ago." The implication hung between us enormous and terrifying and filled with impossible hope. My mother might still be alive. After 24 years of believing she had abandoned me, of grieving a woman I thought was lost forever, she might still be somewhere in this world, close enough to write a letter, recent enough for the postmark to be fresh. And my father had been hiding that truth in his safe, keeping us apart even now. The envelope from my mother remained sealed in my hands. As Lila and I drove away from our father's house, the photographs of his secrets stored safely on my phone. I wanted desperately to tear it open to read whatever words my mother had written, but something held me back. The envelope said to open it after her death, and until I knew for certain whether she was alive or gone, I couldn't bring myself to break that seal. Instead, I focused on another mystery one that had been waiting for me without my knowledge. When Eleanor died 5 years ago, she had left me a small box of personal items, some jewelry, a few books, and a flash drive that had been password protected with encryption I couldn't crack. I had tried dozens of combinations over the years, birthdays, anniversaries, meaningful words, but nothing worked. Eventually, I had stored the drive in my own safe, assuming Eleanor had taken whatever secrets it contained to her grave. But that evening, after dropping Lila at her home with promises to stay in touch, I received an automated email from a service I had never heard of. The subject line read, Time Release Archive. Access granted. The message explained that Eleanor had established a digital archive with a conditional release mechanism. The archive would unlock automatically when certain criteria were met, specifically when my verified net worth exceeded $50 million. The Forbes article with its public valuation of my company had triggered the release. Eleanor had been waiting for me to succeed before she shared her final secrets. I drove home in a daze, retrieved the flash drive from my safe, and entered the password provided in the email. The encryption dissolved, revealing a folder containing video files dated from Eleanor's final months of life. I sat alone in my living room laptop, balanced on my knees, and pressed play on the first video. Eleanor's face filled the screen thinner than I remembered, her illness already visible in the hollows of her cheeks and the shadows beneath her eyes. But her gaze was sharp, her voice steady, and when she spoke, it was with the deliberate clarity of someone who knew exactly what she needed to say. Grace, if you're watching this, it means you've succeeded beyond anything I could have imagined when we first met. It means you're strong enough now to hear the truth, the whole truth about your mother, your family, and why I came into your life. I paused the video, my heart pounding. Then I pressed play again. Your mother and I were college roommates, Eleanor continued. We were 18 years old when we met, both scholarship students, at a school where most people came from money we couldn't imagine. We became best friends within a week, sisters by choice within a month. We told each other everything. We planned our futures together. When she met your father during our junior year, I was the first person she told. Eleanor's expression darkened. I never trusted him. There was something behind his charm that felt calculated, something cold beneath the warmth he showed her. But she was in love, and love makes us blind to warnings we should heed. They married a year after graduation. I was maid of honor at the wedding, smiling in photographs while my stomach churned with worry. The video continued, Eleanor's voice growing heavier with each revelation. When you were born, Grace, I watched your mother transform into someone I barely recognized. Not because of motherhood, she was wonderful with you, absolutely wonderful, but because of what your father was doing to her. The control, the manipulation, the way he isolated her from friends and family, until I was almost the only connection she had left. She called me crying so many times. She wanted to leave, but she was terrified of what he would do. Eleanor paused in the recording, gathering herself. When you were 13, your mother discovered the affair. Not just the affair, the child, Lila. Your father had been maintaining a secret family while pretending to be a devoted husband. Your mother was devastated, but she saw it as her opportunity. She came to me, and we planned her escape. She would take you and leave while he was on a business trip. I had money saved. I would help her start over. My hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the laptop. But your father found out. I don't know how he had spies everywhere, people who reported to him out of fear or greed. He confronted your mother with threats I can barely bring myself to repeat. He said he would accuse her of mental instability, claim she was an unfit parent, hire doctors who would testify to whatever he paid them to say. He had money connections lawyers who would bury her in litigation until she had nothing left. And he made one thing absolutely clear: if she tried to take you, he would ensure she never saw you again. But if she left quietly, if she signed his documents and disappeared, he would at least let you grow up in comfort. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears in the recording. Your mother made an impossible choice, Grace. She could fight and lose everything, including any chance of being part of your life, or she could sacrifice herself to protect you from a custody war that would have destroyed you both. She chose to leave because she loved you too much to put you through that battle. She chose silence because silence was the only protection she could offer. I was sobbing now, tears streaming down my face as 24 years of grief and confusion finally found their true shape. I promised her I would watch over you, Eleanor continued. I promised I would find a way into your life and help you become strong enough to survive without her. When Maggie told me about a young woman living in her car, I knew before I even met you who you were. I had been looking for you for years. The video shifted to Eleanor holding papers, addresses, written in her careful handwriting. Your mother has moved frequently, always staying close enough to know you were safe, never close enough to risk being discovered. I sent her updates whenever I could. Your report cards, graduation announcements, photographs from your company launch. She has watched you from a distance your entire adult life, Grace. She knows who you've become." Eleanor held up a final piece of paper. "This is the last address I have for her from 8 months ago, a small town called Millbrook, 3 states away. I don't know if she's still there. I don't know if she's even still alive. She was ill the last time we spoke, though. She wouldn't tell me how seriously. But if there's any chance she's waiting for you, you deserve to find her." The video paused on Eleanor's face, her expression fierce with love. "Your mother never stopped loving you, Grace. She stopped speaking to you because silence was the only protection she could offer. But now you're strong enough to know the truth. Now you're powerful enough to make your own choices. Go find her. And tell her, Eleanor kept her promise." The video ended. I sat motionless in my dark living room, clutching the paper with my mother's address. Millbrook, 3 hours away by car. After 24 years of believing I had been abandoned, the truth was within driving distance. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get in my car immediately and drive to Millbrook to find the mother I had mourned for 24 years and finally learn the truth from her own lips. But Eleanor had spent years teaching me the value of strategic patience, and I knew that confronting my past without first securing my future would be a mistake. My father was planning his reckoning for Christmas, believing he held all the cards. Before I faced him, before I searched for my mother, I needed to change the game entirely. I needed to take his company. For over a year, I had been quietly acquiring shares in the technology firm where Lila served as CEO, the company built on my stolen algorithm, funded by my father's dirty money, sustained by the intellectual property that had been taken from me when I was young and vulnerable. The company had been struggling for months, hemorrhaging money due to a combination of market shifts, poor management decisions, and my father's increasingly erratic interference in operations he didn't understand. Nervous investors had been looking for exits, and I had been there to provide them through shell companies, with innocuous names, through intermediaries who never revealed their true client, through transactions carefully structured to avoid triggering disclosure requirements. Share by share, quarter by quarter, I had been building my position in secret. By the time Eleanor's video unlocked, I owned 47% of the company, just 3% short of majority control. I spent the next 2 weeks executing the final phase of my plan with surgical precision. Through Samuel, who was now fully committed to his role as double agent, I arranged meetings with key board members. I didn't approach them directly, that would have raised alarms, but through trusted intermediaries who presented my case as a concerned investor seeking to protect shareholder value. The message was simple. The company was failing under current leadership, legal liabilities were mounting, and a change was necessary to avoid catastrophe. Then I revealed my evidence. I presented documentation proving that the core technology underlying the company's products had been stolen from me years ago. Timestamps development records the original code I had written and foolishly demonstrated to Marcus Webb. I showed them the chain of custody, how Webb had taken my work, sold it to my father's shell company, and built an empire on intellectual property that legally belonged to me. The board members sat in stunned silence as they absorbed the implications. If I chose to pursue legal action, the company would be devastated. Years of litigation, billions in potential damages, complete destruction of their market credibility. Everything they had worked for could evaporate in courtrooms and settlement negotiations. But I offered them an alternative. I would acquire majority control of the company at fair market value, discounted appropriately given the legal liabilities I was generously choosing not to pursue immediately. I would install new leadership focused on ethical business practices and sustainable growth. I would protect the jobs of employees who had done nothing wrong. And I would keep the board intact, valuing their experience and institutional knowledge. The only conditions: my father would be removed from any ownership or advisory position, and Lila would step down as CEO. They asked for 48 hours to consider. I gave them 24. The vote was unanimous in my favor. Within a week, I had acquired the additional shares needed for 51% ownership, purchasing them from board members and institutional investors who were relieved to escape the sinking ship. The transaction was completed quietly, documented thoroughly, and structured to withstand any legal challenge my father might attempt. Lila received the news through official channels, a board notification informing her that leadership changes had been approved, and her position as CEO was being terminated. I followed up with a personal call offering her the option. I had promised a face-saving resignation with modest severance, a public statement about pursuing other opportunities, and my word that I would not publicly humiliate her or reveal her role in the data breach. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick with confusion and residual fear. "After everything, why are you being kind to me?" "Because you were a weapon," I said, "not a villain. Weapons don't choose their targets. You were aimed at me by someone who should have protected both of us, and I won't punish you for his sins." Lila accepted the terms with palpable relief. I think part of her had been waiting for years to escape our father's control, and I had finally given her the excuse she needed. The acquisition was announced publicly 3 days later. Business media covered it as a strategic merger, a successful entrepreneur, expanding her portfolio through savvy investment. My father's name was notably absent from the coverage I had made sure of, that wanting him to discover his loss through official channels rather than news alerts. The company built on my stolen work was now mine. The technology that should have been my foundation from the beginning had finally returned to its rightful owner. After the board meeting that formalized my control, I was gathering my documents to leave when an elderly woman approached me. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she had served on the board for 30 years, longer than anyone else, a living institutional memory of the company's entire history. "Ms. Miller," she said quietly, touching my arm to stop me, "may I have a word in private?" We stepped into an empty conference room, and Margaret closed the door behind us. Her eyes, sharp, despite her age, studied me with an intensity that made me feel like she was seeing something beyond my surface. "We've been waiting for someone like you," she said. "Someone with the courage and the resources to do what needed to be done. I want you to know we always knew." "Knew what?" "About the technology, about where it really came from." Margaret's voice dropped even lower. "Your mother would be so proud of what you accomplished today. She was the one who created the original technology your father stole, you know, before you were even born. She was brilliant, truly brilliant, and he took everything from her." I stared at Margaret, unable to speak. "We could never prove it," she continued. "Your father covered his tracks too well, and your mother disappeared before she could fight for what was hers. But some of us remembered. Some of us kept records of our own, waiting for the day when justice might finally be possible." She pressed a business card into my hand. "When you find her, and I believe you will tell her Margaret Chen never forgot. Tell her the board remembers who really built this company, and tell her we're sorry it took so long for someone to make it right." Margaret Chen's words echoed in my mind for days after our conversation. My mother had created the original technology. The foundation of my father's empire wasn't just built on fraud, it was built on stealing from the woman he had driven away. Every piece of the puzzle was connecting now, forming a picture of betrayal so comprehensive it took my breath away. But I didn't have time to process the full weight of these revelations. The Forbes article was about to publish, and everything was about to change. The feature appeared on a Tuesday morning under the headline, "The $86 million Woman Who Refused to Quit." The journalist had done thorough work, tracing my journey from the early struggles of my career to the recent acquisition that had doubled my company's valuation overnight. She wrote about renewed purpose with genuine admiration, highlighting the 15,000 women we had helped return to the workforce, the corporate partnerships we had built, the community we had created for people society had written off as unemployable. The article mentioned my difficult family background in careful, legally vetted language. I had been deliberate about this, refusing to air private grievances, publicly declining to name my father or detail his specific actions. But for anyone who knew our family, the implications were unmistakable. The references to estrangement, to overcoming obstacles placed by those who should have supported her, to building success despite family circumstances that would have broken most people. These phrases painted a picture without filling in every detail. Grace Miller was no longer the forgotten daughter, the family embarrassment the cautionary tale whispered about at holiday gatherings. I was a force to be reckoned with. The response exceeded anything I could have anticipated. Within hours of publication, the article began spreading through communities of older women like wildfire. Support groups shared it on social media with comments about representation and resilience. Career counselors forwarded it to clients as proof that reinvention was possible at any age. Women who had used my platform wrote their own testimonials, creating a groundswell of organic attention that no marketing campaign could have manufactured. My inbox flooded with messages, thousands of them over the following days, each one a story of struggle and hope and gratitude. Women wrote to tell me that my journey had given them courage to apply for jobs they thought were beyond their reach. They shared stories of returning to work after decades of caregiving, of rebuilding careers, after devastating divorces, of refusing to accept that their best years were behind them. Many of them cried as they typed. I could tell from the typos and the raw emotion that spilled across my screen. I read every single message sitting alone in my office late into the night, remembering the parking lot where I had almost given up. I remembered the cold that had seeped into my bones, the hunger that had become a constant companion, the despair that had whispered I would never be anything more than what my father had told me I was. These women had faced their own parking lots, their own moments of almost giving up. And somehow my story had helped them keep going. That was worth more than any Forbes valuation could measure. But while I was reading messages of gratitude and hope, a very different reaction was unfolding at my father's house. Samuel reported the details to me later, piecing together information from his remaining contacts in my father's network. My father had read the Forbes article in cold silence, his face growing darker with each paragraph. When he finished, he made a series of phone calls to lawyers, to business associates, to people whose names Samuel didn't recognize, but whose roles were clearly significant. Patricia's reaction was more vocal, but equally calculating. She immediately recognized the threat I now posed to everything they had built. If I continued gaining power and public sympathy, their carefully constructed narrative about me, the difficult daughter, the unstable girl who had driven her own mother away, the embarrassment best not mentioned, would collapse entirely. My success made their lies untenable. My platform made me impossible to silence. They began planning their countermove. From what Samuel could gather, the strategy involved a coordinated campaign to discredit me before I could reveal what I knew. They would question my mental stability, a tactic my father had used against my mother decades ago. They would suggest that my success was exaggerated, that my business practices were questionable, that my story of hardship was fabricated for sympathy. They would find people willing to speak against me, former employees or competitors who could be paid or pressured into providing damaging quotes. They were going to try to destroy me the way they had destroyed my mother. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I had spent months preparing for exactly this response. I had documentation of every crime my father had committed, from the identity theft of my childhood to the stolen technology to the fraudulent business practices that had built his empire. I had Samuel feeding me intelligence about their plans before they could execute them. I had Lila finally freed from their control, willing to testify to what she had witnessed. I had Margaret Chen and other board members who remembered the truth about my mother's contributions. They thought they were planning a surprise attack. They didn't understand they were walking into an ambush. 3 days after the Forbes article published, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. The number was my father's, a number I had blocked years ago, but had recently unblocked to monitor his communications through Samuel's intelligence gathering. I pressed play and heard my father's voice for the first time in almost a decade. "Grace, sweetheart." His tone dripped with false warmth, the practice charm he deployed when he wanted something. "Congratulations on the article. Your mother and I read it together, and we couldn't be more proud of everything you've accomplished. We know things have been difficult between us, but family is family. We'd love to celebrate your success together." He paused, and when he continued, I could hear the calculation beneath the pleasantness. "Please come for Christmas. It's time our family was reunited, don't you think? We have so much to discuss, so much to make right." I saved the voicemail and sat in silence, turning over his words in my mind. He wanted me at Christmas. He wanted me on his territory, surrounded by his allies, where he believed he could control the confrontation. He was going to get exactly what he asked for. I spent the weeks between the Forbes article and Christmas preparing for the confrontation I had been building toward my entire adult life. I reviewed every document rehearsed, every revelation, anticipated every possible response my father might attempt. When Christmas Eve arrived, I dressed carefully in a simple black dress that conveyed quiet authority, applied minimal makeup, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment before leaving. The woman staring back at me bore little resemblance to the terrified girl who had once flinched at her father's voice. I was ready. My father's house blazed with holiday lights when I pulled into the driveway, every window glowing with carefully staged warmth. The decorations were excessive, the kind of display designed to project prosperity and happiness to anyone passing by. I counted cars in the circular drive, more than a typical family gathering. He had invited an audience. I entered to find exactly what I expected: extended family members I barely recognized, business associates in expensive suits, and two people I identified immediately as local journalists based on the press badges they hadn't bothered to conceal. My father wanted witnesses to his reconciliation with his successful daughter. He wanted the positive publicity of welcoming me back into the fold. He greeted me at the door with an embrace that felt like a trap closing. "Grace, sweetheart, we're so glad you came." I returned the hug with appropriate warmth, playing my role perfectly. "Thank you for inviting me. The house looks beautiful." For the next hour, I performed the part of the prodigal daughter returned. I made small talk with cousins whose names I barely remembered. I complimented Patricia's decorations and accepted a glass of wine I had no intention of drinking. I smiled and nodded and let everyone believe that success had softened me, that Forbes' recognition had made me ready to forgive and forget. The dinner table seated 24 with my father at the head and Patricia at the opposite end. I was placed in a position of honor near my father, close enough for photographs, visible enough for the journalists to observe our apparent reconciliation. Lila sat across from me, her expression carefully neutral, both of us aware that the evening was about to take a turn no one else anticipated. The meal progressed through multiple courses, conversation flowing around topics designed to showcase my father's generosity and wisdom. Finally, as dessert was served, Patricia stood and raised her glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," she announced, her smile radiant with practiced sincerity, "to family unity, to putting aside old misunderstandings, and to Grace." She turned toward me with an expression that somehow combined condescension with apparent warmth, "who has done so well for herself. Perhaps now that you've achieved success, you might consider sharing some of it with those who supported your journey." The table murmured approval. Glasses rose throughout the room. I set my wine glass down without drinking and smiled. "You're absolutely right, Patricia. Let's talk about support." The murmuring stopped. Something in my tone had shifted the energy in the room. "Let's talk about the savings account that was supposedly set aside for my education, the one you gave to Lila, instead leaving me to work 3 jobs while sleeping in my car." I kept my voice calm, conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Let's talk about the job applications I filled out at 4 in the morning because I couldn't afford heat. Let's talk about the technology my father stole from my platform to build a company worth millions." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "Oh wait, that company is mine now. I bought it last month, majority ownership. The board voted unanimously." My father's face had gone pale, then red. "Grace, this is not the time or place. Let's talk about what kind of support this family really provided." I pulled out my phone, already connected to the room's smart TV through preparation I had completed before dinner. With a few taps, documents began appearing on the large screen mounted above the fireplace. These are loan applications bearing my forged signature dated when I was 14 years old. My father used my identity to secure funding for a business venture that collapsed, making his teenage daughter legally responsible for his debts. Gasps rippled through the room. The journalists were typing furiously on their phones. "This is a settlement agreement forcing my mother to leave her family and never contact her daughter again, under threat of losing all access to me permanently." More documents appeared: birth certificates, financial records, the paper trail of decades of fraud and manipulation. "This is who you supported," I said, turning to face the room. A 14-year-old whose identity was stolen by her own father, a mother who was blackmailed into exile, a daughter who was told she was worthless while her inheritance was stolen and given to someone else. I looked directly at my father, whose face had become a mask of barely controlled fury. Would anyone like to toast to that? The room had descended into chaos, business associates making excuses to leave family members arguing in hushed voices, Patricia sobbing in a display I couldn't determine was genuine or theatrical. My father stood frozen at the head of his table, watching his carefully constructed evening collapse around him. I gathered my coat and walked toward the door, then paused at the threshold. "Oh, and Father," he looked at me with eyes full of hatred. I had seen glimpses of my entire childhood finally unmasked. "I found Mom. I'm seeing her tomorrow." I let that sink in, watching the color drain from his face. "Would you like me to pass along any message?" I drove away from my father's house on Christmas night, feeling lighter than I had in decades. The confrontation had been cathartic in ways I hadn't anticipated, not because of the chaos I had caused, but because I had finally spoken truth in the place where lies had been told about me my entire life. The journalists present had captured everything. The business associates had witnessed the documents with their own eyes. My father's carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to rebuild it, or so I thought. Within 48 hours, the counteroffensive began. A tabloid I had never heard of published a lengthy feature with the headline, "Tech Mogul's Disturbing Obsession Inside Grace Miller's Fabricated Family Feud." The article painted me as mentally unstable, a woman consumed by irrational grievances against a loving family who had done nothing but support her. Anonymous sources, their identities protected their payments, undoubtedly substantial, described me as manipulative, dishonest, prone to delusions of persecution. One claimed to be a former employee who had witnessed my erratic behavior. Another presented themselves as a family friend who had watched my parents suffer through my inexplicable hostility for years. The accusations were familiar because I had seen this playbook before. This was exactly what my father had done to my mother when she tried to leave the same tactics, the same language, the same attempt to discredit a woman by questioning her sanity. Then came the television appearance. My father sat on a local morning news program, his face arranged in an expression of wounded paternal love. His voice broke at carefully rehearsed moments as he described his heartbreak over his daughter's wild accusations and concerning mental state. He spoke about how much they had tried to help me over the years, how they had always hoped I would find peace, how painful it was to watch me spiral into these delusions. "We just want her to get the professional help she needs," he said, dabbing at eyes that remained suspiciously dry. "She's our daughter. We love her, but these accusations are destroying our family." The performance was masterful. I watched it alone in my office, feeling the weight of generations of women who had been silenced by exactly this tactic, dismissed as crazy, unstable, hysterical, rather than believed when they spoke inconvenient truths. The attack initially gained traction. My phone buzzed with messages from business contacts expressing carefully worded concern about the controversy. 2 board members called to ask if I was handling the situation appropriately. My company's public relations team fielded calls from journalists seeking comment on my family dispute, their questions framed in ways that assumed my father's version of events might be accurate. But I had anticipated this. I had prepared for exactly this moment. I released a single statement crafted with my legal team to be unassailable. "I will not engage in public disputes about private family matters. My work speaks for itself. For anyone seeking the truth, court documents are public records. I have no further comment." Then I went silent. I didn't defend myself in interviews. I didn't respond to the tabloid accusations. I didn't engage with journalists fishing for dramatic quotes. I simply continued running my company, serving my clients, living my life as if the noise my father was generating didn't exist. And something unexpected happened. What my father didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that thousands of women recognized exactly what he was doing. They had lived it themselves. They had been called crazy by husbands who were cheating unstable, by employers who were discriminating delusional, by families who were abusing. They knew the playbook intimately because it had been used against them. They started sharing their stories on social media using a hashtag that emerged organically, I Stand With Grace. The posts multiplied exponentially, each one a testimony from a woman who had been dismissed and disbelieved when she spoke truth to power. The tabloid story was buried under an avalanche of support, not orchestrated, not paid for, but genuine solidarity from women who saw their own experiences reflected in mine. My inbox filled with messages that made me weep. One woman wrote, "My husband called me crazy for 30 years. He told our children I was unstable. He convinced my own mother I needed to be institutionalized. Your story helped me see I wasn't crazy, he was just afraid of the truth. Thank you for being brave enough to speak." Another wrote, "I watched your father's interview and recognized every tactic. My ex used the same playbook during our divorce. I lost custody of my kids because he convinced a judge I was mentally ill. You're not alone. And neither am I anymore." The messages came from nurses and teachers, from executives and homemakers, from women in their 50s and 60s and 70s who had spent lifetimes being silenced and were finally finding their voices. What my father had intended as an attack became proof of my authenticity. His attempt to isolate me had instead connected me to an army of women who understood. But my father was not finished. When his media strategy failed to destroy my credibility, he escalated to the only arena where his money still gave him advantage: the legal system. The lawsuit arrived by certified mail on New Year's Eve, delivered with timing clearly designed to ruin my holiday. The documents alleged defamation, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The claims were elaborate, the language aggressive, the demands astronomical. My father was suing me for $50 million. I read the complaint in my quiet apartment, watching fireworks explode over the city through my window, and I smiled. He had just made his biggest mistake. The $50 million lawsuit required a legal defense more comprehensive than anything I had ever assembled. I hired the best attorneys I could find, specialists in defamation, family law, corporate litigation, and gave them one directive: uncover everything. I wanted a complete picture of my father's history, his business practices, his vulnerabilities. If he was going to drag me into court, I intended to arrive with enough ammunition to bury him. What my investigators uncovered transformed my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my family. The research began with financial records and business filings, the standard background work for any legal defense. But as my team dug deeper, they found threads that led somewhere unexpected to my paternal grandmother, Margaret Miller, who had died 5 years before I ever saw the Forbes article or confronted my father at Christmas. I had barely known my grandmother. She had been a distant, formidable presence at occasional holiday gatherings, a woman who spoke rarely, but whose words carried absolute authority. My father had deferred to her in ways I found strange, even as a child seeking her approval for decisions that should have been his alone. I had assumed this was simply respect for an elder. I had been catastrophically wrong. The investigators found letters, decades of correspondence between my grandmother and various family members, business associates, and lawyers. They found financial records showing that she had controlled the family's wealth long after my grandfather's death, doling out access to funds based on compliance with her wishes. Most damaging of all, they found journals. My grandmother had kept meticulous records of what she called her management of the family, written in a precise hand that chronicled her interventions with clinical detachment. Reading those journals felt like discovering the operating manual for my own destruction. She had orchestrated everything. The affair that produced Lila had not been my father's independent choice. My grandmother had arranged it, selecting the woman facilitating the meetings, ensuring that the pregnancy occurred. She had wanted leverage over her son, something to guarantee his permanent compliance, and an illegitimate child provided exactly that. The journals documented her satisfaction when the affair was discovered. Now he can never leave. Now he belongs to me completely. My mother's removal had been my grandmother's explicit demand. The journals described her in terms that made my blood boil. The wife is too independent, too ambitious. She has ideas about the business that would undermine everything I've built. She must be removed before she convinces him to break free. My grandmother had pressured my father to drive my mother away, had helped structure the settlement, and non-disclosure agreement had celebrated when my mother finally disappeared. She had seen my mother as a threat to her control and had eliminated that threat with cold efficiency. But the most devastating entries concerned me. "The older girl worries me," my grandmother had written when I was barely 10 years old. "She has her mother's spirit, the same independence, the same ambition, the same dangerous intelligence. If she is allowed to grow powerful, she will destroy everything. She must be contained." The journals documented instructions my grandmother had given my father over the years: deny Grace resources, undermine her confidence, never let her develop the independence that had made her mother dangerous. The systematic destruction of my childhood hadn't been random cruelty. It had been policy handed down from one generation to the next. "Never let the girl become powerful," my grandmother had written. "She will destroy you if you let her grow." Reading these words, I felt something shift in my understanding of my father. He was not simply a villain, he was also a victim. I thought about what it must have been like to grow up under my grandmother's control, to have every decision scrutinized, every relationship managed, every attempt at independence crushed. My father had been trained to see love as control and obedience as loyalty. He had learned that family meant manipulation, that success meant dominance, that the only way to survive was to become the predator rather than the prey. This didn't excuse his choices. He could have broken the cycle. He could have recognized the pattern of abuse and refused to perpetuate it. Instead, he had become his mother's instrument, carrying out her instructions long after her death, destroying his own daughter because a dead woman had told him to. Understanding this didn't bring forgiveness, but it brought clarity. I wasn't fighting just one man. I was fighting generations of poisoned love, a family system that had been diseased long before I was born. My grandmother had created a monster, and my father had willingly become one. The cruelty I had experienced wasn't personal, it was institutional, built into the very foundation of what my family meant. Among the final papers my investigators recovered from my grandmother's estate, they found one last instruction dated just weeks before her death. The handwriting was shakier than her earlier entries, but the intent was unmistakable. "If the older girl ever becomes a threat," she had written, "there is a final option. The file labeled contingency contains everything needed to destroy her completely. Use it only if necessary, but do not hesitate if the moment comes." My investigators searched everywhere for this file. They examined every document from my grandmother's estate, every filing cabinet in my father's possession, every digital archive they could access. The file labeled contingency appeared nowhere. But my grandmother had been meticulous about everything else. If she said the file existed, it existed. Somewhere there was a weapon designed specifically to destroy me, and my father, facing legal warfare he was losing, might be desperate enough to use it. The search for the contingency file consumed my legal team for weeks, but we found nothing. Whatever weapon my grandmother had prepared remained hidden, and I couldn't afford to let paranoia distract me from the battle at hand. The lawsuit was proceeding to a preliminary hearing, and I needed to be ready. The courthouse was a granite monument to justice that felt appropriately weighty for what was about to unfold. I arrived early, dressed in a navy suit that projected competence without aggression, flanked by my legal team. We had prepared extensively, but I carried something my lawyers didn't know about a decision I had made alone in the quiet hours before dawn. My father was already seated when I entered the courtroom. The sight of him stopped me for just a moment. The past month had aged him visibly. His skin had a grayish pallor, and the confident posture I remembered from childhood had collapsed into something hunched and defensive. He looked like a man whose empire was crumbling, which it was. The hearing began with procedural matters, motions, objections, the dry language of legal combat. The judge, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, moved through the preliminaries efficiently before allowing brief statements from both parties. My father's lawyer spoke first, reading a prepared text about family betrayal and wounded paternal love. The words were polished and empty, designed to paint my father as a victim of his ungrateful daughter's public attacks. He spoke of reconciliation attempts, rebuffed of a father's heartbreak of the emotional devastation my accusations had caused. Then it was my turn. I stood feeling the weight of the courtroom's attention and departed entirely from the script my lawyers had prepared. Your Honor, I appreciate the opportunity to address the court directly. I walked toward the front of the room, my voice steady and clear. The plaintiff claims I have defamed him with false accusations. Let me present the truth documented and verified. I introduced the evidence systematically, each piece building on the last. The forged documents bearing my signature from when I was 14, financial fraud committed against a child by her own father. The stolen technology traced through meticulous chain of custody, proving my intellectual property had been taken and monetized without compensation. The settlement agreement that had exiled my mother under duress, threatening her with permanent separation from her daughter if she ever spoke the truth. And finally, the financial records my investigators had uncovered documentation showing that my father's company had been built on fraud that the statute of limitations hadn't quite expired on. Your Honor, I concluded, I am prepared to refer these materials to federal investigators for criminal review. Securities fraud, identity theft, coercion, these are not civil matters. These are crimes. I turned to face my father directly. I am offering a choice. Drop this lawsuit, and I will pursue no criminal referral. Continue, and I will ensure that every relevant authority receives complete documentation of your activities. Either way, I am done living in the shadow of your threats. The decision is yours. My father's lawyers immediately called for a recess. I watched them huddle in frantic consultation, their client's face growing paler by the minute. The hearing suspended for 2 hours while they deliberated. When proceedings resumed, my father's lead attorney stood with obvious reluctance. Your Honor, after careful consideration, my client has decided to withdraw the lawsuit without prejudice. Without prejudice. Corporates speak for surrender while preserving the fiction that they might try again someday. They wouldn't. We both knew it. The judge accepted the withdrawal with barely concealed relief. She had clearly recognized the lawsuit for the harassment it was. As people began gathering their belongings, my father rose slowly from his seat and walked toward me. His lawyers tried to stop him, but he waved them away. He approached until we stood barely 3 feet apart, closer than we had been in years. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, and for the first time in my memory, it held no threat, only exhaustion. You're so much like your mother, it terrifies me, he said. She could have destroyed me if she wanted to. I spent 30 years making sure you couldn't do the same. He paused, something flickering in his eyes that might have been regret. And here you are anyway. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to truth he had ever offered me. He turned to leave, and I let him take 3 steps before I spoke. You still haven't asked. He stopped but didn't turn around. Aren't you even curious whether she's still alive? The woman you exiled, the mother you stole from me? I kept my voice level despite the emotion threatening to crack it. Don't you want to know if your victim survived? My father didn't answer my question. He simply walked out of the courtroom without looking back, his lawyers trailing behind him like anxious shadows. I watched him go, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, only the hollow certainty that one chapter had ended and another was about to begin. The next morning I drove to Vermont. Eleanor's archive had contained multiple addresses spanning 24 years, each one representing another place my mother had fled, to another attempt to stay hidden while remaining close enough to know her daughter was safe. The most recent address led to a small town called Millbrook, population 3,000, nestled in a valley between mountains that were still dusted with late winter snow. The house was modest, a weathered farmhouse set back from a quiet road, its gardens overgrown, its paint peeling in places that suggested years of deferred maintenance. Smoke curled from the chimney proof that someone was home, someone who might be my mother. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, unable to move. Every fear I had carried since age 14 surfaced, now paralyzing me when the answer was just 50 feet away. What if she didn't remember me? What if 24 years of silence had created resentment I couldn't overcome? What if Eleanor had been wrong about everything, and my mother had left not out of sacrifice, but genuine desire to escape a daughter she didn't want? What if I knocked on that door and found a stranger who wanted nothing to do with me? The fears cascaded through my mind, each one more devastating than the last. I had faced down my father in a courtroom. I had built an empire from nothing. I had survived homelessness and betrayal and systematic destruction. But this walking 50 feet to a farmhouse door felt like the hardest thing I had ever attempted. I got out of the car before I could talk myself out of it. The walk to the front door took forever and no time at all. I climbed 3 wooden steps, raised my hand, and knocked before my courage could fail. Footsteps inside, a pause. Then the door opened. The woman standing before me was older than I remembered, thinner, her hair gone completely gray. Time had carved lines into her face that hadn't existed when I was 14, but her eyes were exactly as I remembered them, warm and intelligent, and filled with a love I had convinced myself I had imagined. Neither of us spoke. My mother reached out slowly, as if afraid I might disappear, and touched my face. Her fingers traced my cheekbone, my jaw, the curve of my brow. She was confirming I was real, that this moment was actually happening after 24 years of separation. Then she crumbled. The sobs that shook her body were the sounds of decades of grief finally finding release. She pulled me into her arms with desperate strength, and I held her while we both cried in the doorway of a farmhouse in Vermont, 2 women who had survived impossible circumstances finally reunited. "I watched you every step," she managed between breaths. "Eleanor sent me everything. Your graduation, I have the program. Your first office, she took photographs. The Forbes article." She pulled back to look at my face, tears still streaming. "I cut it out and framed it. It's hanging in my bedroom. I never stopped being your mother, Grace, even when I couldn't be there, even when silence was all I could offer." We went inside and talked for hours, then days. She told me everything. How she had rebuilt a life from nothing after leaving working as a bookkeeper under a different name, always moving when she feared my father might find her. How she had considered reaching out 1,000 times and always stopped terrified that any contact would trigger the retribution she had been threatened with. How she had created the technology my father later stole in their garage during the early years of their marriage when she still believed their partnership was real. Her story and mine were mirror images, survival through impossible circumstances, building from nothing, refusing to let the people who tried to destroy us succeed. On my 3rd day in Vermont, as I prepared to return home, my mother disappeared into her bedroom and emerged carrying a thick folder worn soft with age. "Eleanor wasn't the only one keeping records," she said quietly. "Before I left, I gathered everything I could. Evidence of what your father was doing, the fraud, the theft, the lies. I was too scared to use it then. I thought silence would protect you better than truth." She pressed the folder into my hands. "But you're not scared, are you?" Her eyes searched my face with something like wonder. "You've never been scared. You're everything I hoped you would become." I opened the folder and began reading. Financial records, original patents, correspondence proving my father had stolen my mother's technology and claimed it as his own. This was the evidence that could destroy him completely. I returned from Vermont carrying my mother's folder of evidence and something far more valuable, the knowledge that I had never been abandoned. The weight I had carried since age 14, the belief that I was fundamentally unlovable, had been a lie constructed by my father to control me. The truth was simpler and more devastating. My mother had loved me enough to sacrifice everything, including the chance to watch me grow up. I spent the following days organizing the evidence, consulting with my lawyers about next steps, preparing for whatever countermove my father might attempt. The contingency file still hadn't surfaced, and I remained vigilant for any sign of a final attack. Instead, 2 weeks after my reunion with my mother, a letter arrived at my office. The envelope was plain white, addressed in handwriting I recognized, despite decades of estrangement, my father's precise, controlled script. I held it for several minutes before opening it, bracing myself for whatever manipulation or threat it might contain. What I found inside was something I never expected. 12 pages, handwritten, the script growing more ragged as the letter progressed. He had written it over several sleepless nights, the changing ink colors and slight variations in pressure, revealing the emotional toll of putting these words on paper. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He acknowledged immediately that he didn't deserve it and wasn't seeking it. Instead, he explained. He wrote about his mother, the woman whose journals I had read, whose shadow had shaped everything. He described growing up under her control, the systematic destruction of his independence, the way she had taught him that love meant dominance and family meant ownership. He wrote about the choices that had seemed necessary in the moment and became prison walls he couldn't escape. She shaped me, he wrote, but I made choices. Every cruel word to you was my voice. Every stolen opportunity was my action. I could have been different. I chose to be this. He detailed every wrong he had committed against me. Against my mother, against Lila. The stolen savings, the forged documents, the technology he had taken and built an empire on. The systematic campaign to ensure I never became powerful enough to threaten him. Each confession was specific and unsparing, leaving no room for ambiguity or excuse. He wrote about the courtroom confrontation, how watching me present the evidence of his crimes had shattered something inside him. For the first time in his life, he had seen himself clearly. Not as a patriarch protecting his family, but as a destroyer wearing that mask. The image he had maintained for decades had crumbled, and what remained was a man who had spent his entire life being exactly what his mother had trained him to be. I started therapy the week after the hearing, he wrote. Not because of your legal threats, but because I couldn't look at myself anymore. I couldn't pretend that what I saw in the mirror was anything but a monster. The letter continued with something I never believed I would receive: accountability. I'm turning myself in for the fraud, he wrote. The identity theft, the financial crimes, everything. It's time to stop running from what I did. It's time to accept consequences I should have faced decades ago. Enclosed with the letter was a formal document, a transfer of his remaining shares in the family company to Lila and me, split equally with no conditions attached. He was liquidating his personal assets to establish a trust for future grandchildren, children he acknowledged he might never meet. He expected to serve time for the fraud charges, and he wrote that he welcomed it. Prison might be the first honest place I've ever lived, the letter said. At least there I can't pretend to be something I'm not. The final page was brief. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything. You are exactly what your mother hoped you would become and exactly what my mother feared. I spent 30 years trying to break you, and you became unbreakable anyway. He signed it simply, Your Father. I finished reading and stared at the wall of my office for a long time. The afternoon light shifted across the room as I sat motionless, processing words I had never imagined receiving. This wasn't manipulation. This wasn't strategy. This was a man finally confronting the wreckage of his own choices. It didn't erase the past. It didn't heal the wounds. But it was something I had never believed possible, the truth freely offered, without conditions or demands. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized, but never called. He answered on the second ring, his voice uncertain. Hello, Dad, I said. We should talk. Not about the past, about what happens next. We agreed to meet at a public park 3 days later, neutral ground. I chose deliberately a place where neither of us held power, where we could speak as two people rather than as weapons aimed at each other. The morning was cool and bright, early spring sunlight filtering through trees just beginning to show their first green leaves. I arrived early and found a bench overlooking a small pond where ducks glided through water that reflected the pale blue sky. When my father appeared on the path, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not defeated exactly, but the performance of dominance that had defined him my entire life was gone. He walked slowly, his shoulders rounded, his expensive suit replaced by simple clothes that seemed to belong to a different person. When he sat down beside me on the bench, maintaining careful distance, I saw that his eyes were red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept well in weeks. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the ducks trace patterns across the water. I spoke first. I read your letter. I believe you mean it today. I kept my voice measured, neither warm nor cold. What I don't know is whether you'll mean it tomorrow. You've had a lifetime of choosing cruelty. One letter doesn't erase that." My father nodded slowly, accepting this without argument. "You're right to doubt me," he said. "I've given you no reason to believe anything I say. All I can tell you is what I'm doing, not what I'm promising." He told me about his therapy sessions 3 times a week now with a specialist in narcissistic behavior patterns. He had received a diagnosis that traced his dysfunction to his own childhood trauma, the systematic destruction of his autonomy by a mother who saw control as love. He didn't offer this as an excuse, he was careful to emphasize, just as explanation. "I spent 40 years being terrified of becoming my mother," he said quietly, "and somewhere along the way I became exactly what I feared. The same manipulation, the same conditional love, the same need to control everyone around me." He paused, staring at the pond. "I became her. The person I hated most I became, and I was too proud to stop even when I knew what I was doing, even when I watched myself destroy you the way she destroyed me." It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. No performances, no positioning, no careful management of image. Just a broken man finally acknowledging the wreckage he had created. I let the silence stretch before responding. "I'm going to establish some boundaries," I said, "and you're going to respect them without argument, or this conversation is the last one we'll ever have." He nodded. "I will not pretend the past didn't happen. I will not minimize what you did to me, to my mother, to Lila. The truth is the truth, and I won't help you hide from it." "I understand. I will not facilitate your relationship with my mother. Whatever bridge existed between you, you burned it beyond repair. She has rebuilt her life without you, and you will not be part of it. I'm not finished." I held up my hand. "I will not invite you into my life regularly. Any contact between us will be on my terms when I choose, if I choose. You don't get to decide when we talk or what we discuss." My father remained silent, accepting each condition. "But I will not pursue the criminal charges personally," I continued. "Whatever evidence exists, I'll let the justice system handle it. If they choose to prosecute, that's their decision. I won't be the one who puts you in prison." His eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected this. "And if you maintain this transformation genuinely, consistently, verified by actions rather than words, I may someday consider a limited relationship. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but perhaps something that doesn't require us to be enemies." I stood up from the bench and looked down at him. "That's more than you gave me," I said. "Consider it grace. Consider it my name." I walked away without looking back, following the path around the pond toward the parking lot. I had gone perhaps 50 yards when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Lila. "I've been thinking about everything that happened, about Mom, your mom, I mean, and about where I really came from. I'm ready to meet her too if she'll see me. Will you take me with you? I need to understand where I came from. I need to understand who I am." I stopped on the path, reading the message twice. Then I typed my reply. "Yes, I'll take you. She wants to meet you too." The drive to Vermont with Lila was the beginning of something none of us could have predicted. My mother welcomed her with the same grace she had shown me, not as the child of an affair, not as a symbol of betrayal, but as another victim of a man who had damaged everyone he touched. The 3 of us spent a week together in that weathered farmhouse, untangling decades of lies, building connections that should have existed from the beginning. 1 year later, I stood on a stage before an audience of 3,000 people. The convention center was filled to capacity, every seat occupied by women who had come from across the country for this moment. The occasion was the launch of the Eleanor Foundation, a nationwide initiative combining my company's platform with substantial funding from the acquisition and donations from supporters who had believed in my story when it was just words on a Forbes page. In the front row sat 3 women who represented everything I had fought for. Lila, nervously proud her journey from golden child to genuine sister still unfolding. My mother, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, finally able to witness her daughter's success in person rather than through photographs sent by a friend. and beside them, represented by a framed photograph I had placed on an empty chair, was Eleanor, the woman whose $5,000 had grown into something that would help millions. I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces. "I'm not here to talk about revenge," I began. "I know that's what some of you expected. The wronged daughter finally triumphant, gloating over the defeat of those who hurt her. But that's not my story. That's not why I built any of this." The audience was silent, attentive. "I'm here to talk about resilience, about the women who lifted me when I had nothing, a homeless stranger who shared her sandwich, a mentor who saw potential I couldn't see in myself, a mother who sacrificed everything to protect me, even when I didn't know she existed." I paused, letting the words settle. I could have used everything I learned to destroy my father. I had the evidence. I had the resources. I had every justification. But I chose something different. I chose to build something that destroys the conditions that created him. I gripped the podium, speaking from somewhere deeper than prepared remarks. Generational trauma ends when someone decides to absorb the pain instead of passing it on. My grandmother passed her pain to my father. My father tried to pass it to me. But I decided somewhere in a frozen parking lot, somewhere in Eleanor's office, somewhere in the moment I chose to build, rather than destroy, I decided the cycle would end with me. I looked directly at the audience. You can decide too. Whatever pain was given to you, whatever trauma shaped you, whatever cruelty tried to break you, you have the power to choose differently. You have the power to become unforgettable. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted 4 full minutes. I stood at the podium, overwhelmed, watching 3,000 women applaud not just my story but their own, every struggle they had survived, every obstacle they had overcome, every moment they had refused to give up. After the ceremony, I made my way through the crowd, accepting congratulations from strangers who felt like family. But my attention was elsewhere, searching for the 2 women who mattered most. I found them standing together near the back of the hall. My mother and Lila, 2 people who were never supposed to meet, united by choices I had made. They were talking quietly, their heads close together, and as I approached, I saw my mother reach out and touch Lila's face with heartbreaking gentleness. "You were just a baby," my mother said softly. "I never blamed you for what your father did. None of it was your fault. None of it was ever your fault." Lila broke down completely, receiving an absolution she hadn't known she needed. My mother pulled her into an embrace, holding her the way she had once held me, and I watched 2 more broken pieces becoming whole. I joined them, and we stood together, 3 women bound, not by the man who had damaged all of us, but by our choice to heal rather than hate. For the first time in my life, I understood that what I had been building wasn't just success. It was family. Real family. Chosen, earned, healed. That night, alone in my office at midnight, I sat looking at the photograph of Eleanor that hung on my wall. The building was silent, the city lights glittering beyond my window, and I felt a peace I had never known before. I whispered the words I had been waiting my whole life to say. They called me useless. They called me invisible. They tried to erase me before I could become anything. I smiled at Eleanor's photograph. Turns out I was unforgettable. I touched the frame gently. And so are you if you're listening to this. So are you. And that, dear listeners, is the story of Grace Miller, a woman who was told she would never amount to anything and became unforgettable anyway. But here's what I want you to understand. This story isn't just about Grace. It's about every woman who has ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told she wasn't enough. It's about every mother who sacrificed everything for her children. It's about every person who refused to let their past define their future. Grace started with nothing but $5,000 and the belief that she deserved better. She ended with an $86 million company and a foundation that helps thousands of women rebuild their lives. But her greatest victory wasn't the money or the success, it was breaking the cycle of pain that had poisoned her family for generations. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by people who should have believed in you? Have you ever been called useless, invisible, or worthless, only to prove them wrong? Have you ever had to choose between revenge and healing, between destruction and building something better? Share your story in the comments below. Tell us about the moment you decided to become unforgettable. Your words might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this story touched your heart, if Grace's journey reminded you of your own strength, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Every subscription helps us reach more women who need to know they're not alone. Remember what Grace said at the end: you have the power to decide. You have the power to absorb the pain instead of passing it on. You have the power to become unforgettable. So what will you choose? Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay strong, stay resilient, and never forget your story matters too.